Technicians of Spaceship Earth, welcome to HAWKBINGE, your ongoing translation of the alien language that is the Hawkwind discography, one album at a time, in the company of a long-term fan, which is me, and your favourite first-time abductee, Sputnik Matt. How you doing, Matt?
I'm very well, thank you, Andy. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the show.
It's been a while.
I think even sometimes we get a little frustrated by how sparse the episodes are, but also these last couple of months we've been both very busy in different parts of the world, and it just hasn't been possible.
No, it has been mad, and occasionally we'll get a message from someone who'll go, I've just discovered the podcast and I've binged all the episodes, and it's like, you should have drawn that out a little bit more. But yeah, here we are. And a lot has happened in Hawkwind world since last we met. First off, actually, last time we met was at the New Day Festival, which now feels like ancient history. But we both went along because not only were Hawkwind headlining, but Gong were second on the bill. And that was a pretty good day.
It was very cool. It was something which I was able to fly over for and actually make good time on, which is rare given my normal trying to see Hawkwind. But it was really nice seeing them in a different way because we've seen them now in festival halls, we've seen them in London, but never al fresco. So it was very nice to be able to take in some of the nice UK summertime, which now, as you're saying, does feel a long time ago. But it was great because Gong were on the other stage, so we were able to check them out and then just run over to the other stage where Hawkwind was ready to go. And as a back-to-back sonic experience, it's pretty cool. Hawkwind themselves were on the main stage. There was that nice feeling of the hill in front of them sloping down, so everyone got a good view of them. They had a big light show. They had their visuals from the Royal Albert Hall, and they were on good form and just blasted out for an hour and a half or something. So I felt like we got our time's worth from them. It was great.
Absolutely. It was a good long set and a good festival. I liked it. I've never been to New Day before, but the whole vibe of the thing was very, very cool and very, very chill. And I'm glad you got to see Gong because I banged on about them to you for a little while. So a good 1-2 punch. And we met a few people who came up to us and said, are you Andy and Matt? Obviously, the T-shirts we were wearing were a bit of a giveaway, but even so, that was quite nice to meet some listeners.
Really was. It was quite funny. Whenever they did, we were always doing something really awkward, like we had a mouthful of pizza or we were, trying to figure out where we were or something like that. But it was great for people to actually come up and say hi and actually, put some faces and names to some listeners, which was really fun. And everyone was just super enthusiastic. It wasn't a big festival, but clearly everyone was there for a good time. There was some really nice architecture around and some gorgeous grounds as well surrounding it. Yeah,
there were people watching from like a bridge or something. The whole setting was beautiful and Hawkwind playing as sunset. So that was a fun one. Some other news from Hawkwind is that since we last recorded, the box sets and remasters of both In Search for Space and Do Re Mi Fa Sol La Ti Do have been released. And these are particularly interesting in as much as they are not just remastered, but there are new stereo remixes and 5.1 remixes. We know, obviously, Stephen Wilson did the Warrior on the Edge of Time sets with the 5.1 and the stereo remixes, also did all of the Calvert era in the Box Days of the Underground. So we kind of just associate him with these things. But these have been done by someone I hadn't previously heard of called Stephen W. Taylor. And he's done a heroic effort. The new stereo remixes, the 5.1 remixes, and the remaster, they're all absolutely amazing. We'd mentioned, I think, that when we eventually get to the end of the canon run, one thing that we would do would be to revisit 2 or 3 early albums to see how you respond to those now that you do have the context of everything that's been before. But a big, big thing for you back then was the production. So it'd be interesting when we do redux those albums, you being able to hear it with that barrier removed. It'll be really interesting to see how that goes down.
Yeah, and I think it's a highly appropriate reason to go back to some of those. Even when we were recording them ourselves, if ever I listen back to them, I always cringe at the fact that I'm literally under a blanket with a terrible Rode microphone trying to sound good. So it would be great for us to do our own 5.1 mixes of our reviews just to keep the quality where it is now.
Absolutely. And another thing, by the way, on those box sets for everybody out there, a guy called Hugh Gilmore puts all the packaging, like the book together and everything else, and does a fantastic job. And I knew him because he did the same on the Black Sabbath box sets that I really like. So good job all round. And I got the Rough Trade exclusive splatter vinyls too, which are nice because that's my go-to. So plenty of Hawkwind. A really interesting thing was that I received a link from the one and only Magnus Martin of Hawkwind fame and other bands' fame to a new album released by his son, Silas Martin, called Tangential. So I gave that a listen, and it's really interesting. It's very jazzy, very relaxed. A lot of it gave me this Sunday kind of a vibe, which hopefully means something. And it's instrumental except for the last track. I would say there's a track on there called Tunnels, which has emerged as a favourite for me. And it's a bit more aggressive. It's quite Steve Hackety, for want of a different analogy. And Magnus is on the last two tracks. And all in all, it is definitely a worthwhile listen. It's really something to sink into, and an interesting one. So check that out, everybody. Aside from Silas Martin and all of the Hawkwind box sets and remixes on my side, what else has been on the turntable these past few months since last we recorded, Matt?
I was talking to a friend recently and the band Super Heavy came up, which I don't know if you remember, but it was a self-titled supergroup, quote unquote, consisting of Mick Jagger, Joss Stone, Dave Stewart, Ala Rahman and Damian Marley. I think there was a lot of hype around it when it was set to drop, and then I think when it dropped it ended up being a pretty mid kind of album, but it got me to thinking about what I would consider a supergroup. And I'm going to add two examples of these to the playlists today, so I have a little bit of a theme. I'm going to start with some serious talents, which is Them Crooked Vultures. And Them Crooked Vultures are Josh Homme on lead vocals and guitar, John Paul Jones on bass and keys, Dave Grohl on drums and backing vocals, Alan Johannes does some rhythm guitar as well. It felt like a very flash-in-the-pan collaboration between them all, and it spawned one crazy album on one very frantic tour. I remember we saw them in Hammersmith Apollo in December of 2009, so around this time, quite some time ago. We scored tickets on the morning of the day they went on sale, and when some of our friends went to pick some up in the evening, it had already sold out, so I remember it being absolutely packed. There was no empty seats in the house, and it was just a crazy gig because you had people like us that went to see more of Josh Homme, but then we had people older than us there for John Paul Jones and a bunch of teenagers there for Dave Grohl. But, you know, the atmosphere was electric. The whole thing was very cool. I feel like the band has Josh Holmes' influence all over it. It's quite slow, lots of swung grooves, catchy riffs, parts where the band really synchronizes masterfully for that bridge or fill, but it's still got its own offering, I think. There's a chance for each of the superstars to really make their presence felt. And I still play that album and I still feel like I want more. For the meantime, I'm going to put the opening track, No One Loves Me, Neither Do I, into the playlist for its lazy, swaggery, braggadocious charisma. I don't think we'll see a group like that arrive and disband ever again.
No, and I like the fact you've chosen them, and I actually hope that they don't record something else purely for the hugely selfish reason that they came, they played, and they went, and we were there.
Yeah, exactly.
If they come back and do it all again, that will have less currency than I feel it currently has. So I've got one that's comparatively new and one that's very, very old and very surprising. We haven't gone there before. The one that's rather new, we went to see Fatso Jetson, who I have picked before, and Yawning Man play. And I remember Yawning Man opened. And the amusing thing was that at the break, Yawning Man were sorting out the kit for Fatso Jetson. And we thought, wow, that seems a bit harsh. And then we found out that actually Fatso Jetson was basically Yawning Man, but with a different bass player, which was the son, I think, of the guitarist or something like that. And Fatso Jetson was the band that I remember being brilliant. Yawning Man I liked well enough, but I didn't go big on. But then recently, by chance, I heard a track from their 2019 album Macedonian Lines, which is on Heavy Psych Sounds, which is obviously one of our favourites. And it blew me away. I loved the track. And so I listened to the rest of the album and I loved the rest of the album. It has that Yawning Man desert chilled vibe, but there's a lot more going on in it. It's all instrumental, but beautifully done and well worth a listen. The track I've chosen is I Make Weird Choices, which just has some killer riffs and hooks in it. So yeah, Yawning Man, Macedonian Lines. That's my turntable pick number 1.
Nice. So my supergroup number 2 is dedicated to Mike Patton. And we've mentioned Mike Patton several times in this podcast, so I figured it was about time we added him to the playlist. And I've decided to put him in his supergroup guise as Peeping Tom. Peeping Tom is a slightly different take on the idea of a supergroup, as it's not strictly speaking a band, more of Patton collaborating with a bunch of other musicians, but seeing as those musicians feature Norah Jones, Kool Keith, Massive Attack, Kid Koala and Babel Gilberto, I would still consider it a super collab if not a supergroup, but when you put it all together it sounds pretty super. Like Them Crooked Vultures, it's an eponymous album, and Mike Patton said about it in an interview, in a way it's an exercise for me, taking all these things I've learned over the years and putting them into a pop format, and judging the album from that quote, it's a total failure, but a glorious failure, because there is nothing pop about this album at all. It's dark, moody, heavy, crushingly claustrophobic in places, but that's also why I love it. The album's hugely varied, so finding a track to encapsulate it in its entirety is impossible, but the track that always brings me back to this album is Don't Even Trip, featuring Amon Tobin. So that's what's going on the playlist. So that's Don't Even Trip, which is Peeping Tom, aka Mike Patton, on the album Peeping Tom. I don't think as well there is another Peeping Tom album. If there is, I haven't seen it.
Nope, there isn't.
So two things that came, went and exploded and were never seen from again, but left one hell of an impact with me.
Exactly. And I can actually say that I saw Peeping Tom as well. They did the one tour and I saw it. So I'm 2 for 2.
So what's your old one?
When I listened to this and realised it hadn't been included on a sessions playlist, I was like, how did that happen? Because it's so obvious. It is Pink Floyd. And Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun is the track from the album A Saucer Full of Secrets from 1966 on EMI Columbia. And it seems odd, given who we are and what we do, that we've got all this way through without a Floyd reference in here somewhere. And if there's going to be a Floyd reference, it has to be this one. It's definitely a period of Floyd that I've got fonder and fonder of. The intro to Floyd for many people is the big 4 albums, Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals and The Wall. And those are the albums from which Roger Waters and, until fairly recently, David Gilmour would be playing. They're the big tracks. But the drummer, Nick Mason, he has a band called A Source Full of Secrets who play only the early stuff, anything pre-Dark Side. So I've seen them a couple of times and they are fabulous. And Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun is absolutely pinnacle, I think, of early Pink Floyd. And now we've addressed that failing of mine not to have it on the playlist before. Now it is. And that is the Turntable Picks. Have we heard from anybody in the many years since we last recorded?
I've got 2 emails, one from a listener called Mauro, who got in touch to say thanks for the great idea you had. And I'm saying you had because this was your idea, Andy, so great job for the idea that you had. He also added, I first encountered Hawkwind many years ago after reading somewhere that their music was in some way inspired by early Floyd, of whom I was and still am a fan. So how about that for some timely dropping?
Topical.
Yes, exactly. He continues, I gave them a very quick listen and decided it was not my cup of tea. Then, a few years ago, stumbled on them again, and this time I took my time to actually listen to them. It was mind-blowing, and here I am. He then said, you really need to actually listen attentively to their albums to appreciate them, but in their best moments, they are truly exceptional. And I think we would agree with that, seeing as that is what we do. So thanks for the mail, Maro, and welcome aboard. The second mail is from Mr. Tony Croton, who mailed in to say that he has been a Hawkwind fan since the early 80s, first discovering them by listening to Space Ritual, which he hated on first listen, but after the third listen he was hooked, and now thinks he may have one of the largest Hawkwind record collections out there. After checking his inventory out, I would be surprised if that wasn't the case. Get this, Andy. Every album on vinyl, all first pressings, all the 7, 10 and 12 inches, a few picture discs, and approximately 40 pressings of Silver Machine, maybe a few with an actual bike on the cover and not a car, who knows? He didn't specify.
Wow.
Thanks for mailing in to show off, Tony. From one collector to another, I can offer a respect on that. On YouTube, our favourite Elric commented about you, Andy, on the It Is the Business of the Future to Be Dangerous episode. I hope you got Matt to listen to the business trip. I can confirm that he didn't, but that will happen at some point. And a bunch of people also complained that we didn't cover the Palace Springs album, but I can take solace in the fact that we have some good post-Wikipedia canon albums to go through when we finish chewing through what has been deemed studio albums by whoever takes care of the Hawkwind wiki.
Absolutely, and there are some tracks on Palace Springs, which we will definitely be coming back to as part of our roundup of the decade when we look at orphan tracks and things that didn't make the canon albums that we do talk about. So Palace Springs will come into the spotlight for a little bit when we get that far. But Wikipedia doesn't list it as a canon album, and Wikipedia is the arbiter of such things as far as Hawkbinge is concerned.
That about wraps it up for the mailbag, I think, Andy.
Cool. So we are about to go back to 1995 and reacquaint ourselves with that year. Obviously, this is the second album from Hawkwind to come out that year after White Zone. But before we go back and start getting into the scene, the times and the music and where Hawkwind were at, I am very happy to tell you that there is a big piece of bonus content at the end of this podcast, as we will be talking to the one and only Mr. Joe Banks about his new Hawkwind book. And very good it is too, to have Mr. Banks back on home ground. So we've already covered half of 1995. White Zone came out in the first half of the year. So in that episode, we looked at albums that came out between January and June. So these are albums that come out between July and the end of the year in 95. The Hawkwind album coming out in the second half of the year. There are some interesting debuts. We talked about Dave Grohl, Foo Fighters' debut album, comes out in 1995. Rammstein, their debut album, comes out in 95. The Deftones, Adrenaline. Garbage, their debut. Ben Folds 5, their debut. So there's a lot of debuts of bands that are around for quite a long time, some of whom still having an impact now. Caius, when we go back to Josh Homme, their last album, And the Circus Leaves Town, and what an album it is. The last Ramones album, Adios Amigos. Procol Harum, The Long Goodbye. Jethro Tull have an album this year, Roots to Branches. But this is the year of the big Britpop feud between Blur and Oasis. And Blur have The Great Escape and Oasis have What's the Story, Morning Glory come out this year. And the big singles were going neck and neck, and that was what the headlines were about. But of course, we all know now with the benefit of hindsight that they all fade in comparison to Pulp, who brought out Different Class this year and are clearly the winners, the third team to win the two-horse race. Red Hot Chili Peppers, One Hot Minute, and Skunk Anansie, Paranoid and Sunburnt come out this year. Echo Belly have an album called Oh, The Flaming Lips, Clouds Taste Metallic comes out this year. Iron Maiden have an interesting album called The X Factor, which is one of their two albums with Blaze Bayley singing instead of regular singer Bruce Dickinson. Simply Red, Life, unfortunately. Green Day, Insomniac, unfortunately. Fleetwood Mac, Time is out this year. Black Grape, It's Great When You're Straight. GZR, Plastic Planet, which is Geezer Butler's album with his second band. And it's a brilliant album. And I sat through an hour and a half of a Black Sabbath podcast where they reviewed it, and they both absolutely hated it. So it was a painful 2 hours where they destroyed every track, but I really like it. Ozzy Osbourne comes out with Osmosis this year. Erasure have Erasure. Brian Eno and Jar Wobble bring out Spinner. And I have to listen to this because that is a combination that sounds truly rad. Cypress Hill, Temples of Boom, great album. Queen, Made in Heaven, not a great album. Alice in Chains, eponymous album, brilliant. GZA, Liquid Swords, that's probably one that you know quite well, I would guess, Matt. Bruce Springsteen, The Ghost of Tom Jones. Stevie Wonder, Natural Wonder, and LL Cool J, Mr. Smith. All of those albums coming out in the second half of 95. But actually, it's the singles, I think, that really, really take me back to 1995. We already covered the big 5 singles from this year, which were Coolio, Shaggy, Take That, Michael Jackson, and U2. But actually, this is the year of All Right by Supergrass. It's also the year of Breakfast at Tiffany's by Deep Blue Something. And I can't forget Breakfast at Tiffany's, much though I might like to, but I've never even heard of Deep Blue Something. So that's one of those weird ones where the song transcends the band and then some. Weezer, Buddy Holly is this year. We talked about Pulp. This is the year of Common People, which clearly is the better Britpop song. 9 Inch Nails bring out Hurt this year, which is memorable to me because obviously it became famous as Johnny Cash doing the cover of it many years later. And this will take you to 1995 if nothing else does. This is the year of I'll Be There For You by the Rembrandts. This is the year of Friends. Friends instantly takes me back all that way. So that is the musical landscape of 1995. Hawkwind, having already released White Zone under a different name, Psychedelic Warriors, are joined now by several other people. So Hawkwind, obviously being Dave Brock, Alan Davey, and Richard Chadwick, are joined by a man called Ron Tree. So they went from being a trio to a four-piece. And in her mighty tome, The Saga of Hawkwind, Carol Clark writes this. They found me in the gutter, declared Ron in an interview shortly after joining Hawkwind. We met at festivals. I'd just been playing in lots of different bands and doing a few support gigs. I wrote to Dave to see if he needed a singer and he gave me a go. And so far it's been going all right. Ron, a bass player turned singer, was talking in Ontario in 1995. In another interview the same month, he stated, they were a three-piece and a bit sparse. I just said to Dave, I'll do a good job for you. So this is the introduction of Ron Tree into Hawkwind. Richard Chadwick continues in the same book. Dave had known Ron from the north of England. He'd been badgering Dave. I can effing sing. I can have a go. He was a really good frontman. He did a really powerful voice. He'd do all the singing parts Dave or Alan couldn't or wouldn't do. And it worked very well for a while. He had a fascination with aliens. And Alan was into the same sort of thing. Ron said, let's make an album about alien abductions. In the summer, Hawkwind did just that. Ron dived into it with gusto, continues Richard. He had an effects pedal for his vocal. It could make it weird, mimic the effects of squeaky, demonic, giggling aliens. He did revitalise and reinvigorate the band. So this is the entry to the stage of Ron Tree. He gets compared a lot in the books and articles to Robert Calvert, which, although I totally 100% get that, it's also slightly unfair because those are big shoes to fill. And on several later tracks, they are joined on guitar by Jerry Richards, who had played in bands Tubular Dog and The Agents of Chaos, both with Dave Brock, so he'd been around. And he plays on some later tracks, and we will hear more of Jerry Richards in future episodes. The album was recorded at Rockfield and once again produced by Hawkwind and Paul Cobbold, so he's definitely been around for quite a while now. It's released in October of 1995 on Emergency Broadcast Systems, on CD and double vinyl, and I missed the double vinyl. Actually, to be honest, I missed the CD because I was very much into my Hawkwind wilderness years at this point. I did eventually pick up a CD, but the double vinyl now goes for quite a lot of money if you look at Discogs, so I haven't invested in that. It did not chart. So, Matt, that is where Hawkwind are in 1995 when they release Alien 4. You've hopefully given this more listens than any man should give anything ever. What's your hot take?
Someone left a YouTube comment a while back saying that they found that the gap between episodes went some way to let them know how much of a problem I was having with the album. And while we've both have actually been quite busy since we dropped White Zone, I have to say that's probably true for Alien 4. If you ignore White Zone, as many people clearly did, Alien 4 isn't so much a departure from It Is the Business of the Future to Be Dangerous as more of an attempt to return to a Hawkwind of yesteryear in vibe, I would say. And while that's an interesting direction for them to go, I feel like they've gone back to quite a lot of things which I personally am not a huge fan of. It comes over in the ways the tracks have been created. I feel like the style in which many of them are played and the lyrical content and the fact that some of the tracks are almost covers of things from previous albums, mainly from the 80s, but one from the 70s as well. It feels like while we're walking forwards, we're looking over our shoulder for most of the album, which is maybe a little bit of a shame given that the Business of the Future was trying to push out, I felt, in interesting new directions. It does mean that the album itself feels a little confused, and because of that, it feels a little bit maybe of a grab bag. And while there are some bits I do like, I find that the album itself has failed to really grab me, even though I've tried to listen to it as much as possible and really tried to get on with it. When I first started listening to this album, the first note I wrote was just the word ridiculous. Further listening, I will say, has embellished on that note, so it now says ridiculous in parts. So while that has improved, it hasn't come too far away from my initial feeling of this album. I mean, from a sonic point of view, I did play this album a few times very loud, like neighbor annoyingly loud, and I did get a real sense for a lot of overall production quality and depth. There is a very well resolved sound, so it doesn't sound bad in terms of the sonics, it sounds bad in the content, if you see what I mean. It just doesn't grab me in a way that sparks joy a lot. I like to split this album into two parts. There's pre-Vega and then there's post-Vega. And pre-Vega is not my favourite stuff that Hawkwind's ever done. Post-Vega I like a lot more. There's still places where I find it a bit weird, but all the tracks that I actually like I would say are post-Vega. I found the inclusion of Ron Tree not my favourite addition. For a start, I wasn't sure if this was a joke and it was like Rhonda Tree or something, because I thought it might have been a female singer, mainly because of the pitch and the way that it's sung. But I guess now that you've said it has so many effects on the vocals that actually I'm sure he's probably just pitching and messing around. And I assumed that there was pitching and messing around because there are some bits that clearly go out into insanity as they're played. The theme, I find it hard to take seriously. I always have a little difficulty with some sci-fi, and I feel like the slight amateur dramatic delivery mixed with that particular genre I find incredibly difficult to deal with. So this album wasn't ever going to be my favourite. I am looking forward to saying some nice things though about some tracks, but I think on the whole I can see why it didn't chart.
This will be very, very interesting. Obviously, I was kind of out of Hawkwind at this point. This was the last album that I bought that I knew was a current album, but it was so beyond the other things I was listening to at that point that I'd play it once or twice, and there were some things in there that I knew. Sputnik Stan has always been a song that I've always remembered, but I didn't really remember the rest of it. Coming back to it now, this is the first time I've ever properly dived deep into it and played it repeatedly and listened to it all the way through and actually listened to it repeatedly. And I find the things that I like in this, I think will be the things that you don't like. And some of the things that you do like might be the things that I'm a bit more meh about. But it's interesting your point about how you approach this if you ignore White Zone, because this actually feels spiritually to me closer to Electric Teepee in terms of the fact that it is a mixture of out and out rock tracks and out and out sweeping electronic stuff. There's a lot in the books about how there's a little bit of a tug of war going on between Alan Davey, who wanted the band to be more rocky, and the rest of the band who wanted to be more electronic. And in that friction, interesting things happen, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. And if you think of it, as you say, without White Zone, which I hadn't done before you said it, it stands out like that. I quite like the sci-fi. I mean, obviously, I am all-consuming science fiction. And I remember around this time, there would have been things like The X-Files. So this whole aliens among us thing, which now feels a little bit conspiracy theory, back then felt a lot more part of mainstream culture. So I get that, and I like that side of it. I like the fact they dived into it and actually had a concept for the album. And strangely, I think differently about the album as a whole than I do about its component parts. It'll be interesting to get into that. So let's dive in. But before I get you to talk about that first track, Abducted, there's an interesting piece here in Ian Abrams' fantastic book, Sonic Assassins, where they talk about this. Ian says, Alien 4 starts with a spoken word passage, Abduction, invoking contemporary mythology of otherworldly visitations and the apparently widespread belief among Americans that humans are regularly taken aboard alien spacecraft and subjected to experimentation. It goes on to borrow from the archetypes of the new breed, the post-Little Green Man, post-Bug-Eyed Monster view of alien visitors. Large black eyes, reptilian and insectile facial qualities describe one facet, but there are also the little ones that are so blissful. What really horrifies the narrator, though, are the ugly ones who are like lava inside leather-faced skin of a hard, dark, scary machine. It's as though Tree has opened his creative account with Hawkwind by declaiming the contents of his most deep-seated nightmares. Quote, I was doing stuff about aliens because I know they exist. There is no doubt. Anybody who doesn't believe in aliens is a fool. A total fool. Ian says this fool reserves comment. Matt, Abduction.
As Ian says, we start the album with this piece which I think is supposed to set us up for the album in general. We have this slowly rising synth pad, which gives the impression of maybe like a system powering up or a ship taking off, but in a more pleasant way. But then that pleasantness is rather shattered at the peak of its ascent when this low drone comes in to add more oppressive atmosphere. And given that the track is called Abducted, that's much more the tone I think we're all expecting. I imagine that the first sound is the craft making its getaway, and then we transition inside the craft where we find our unlucky narrator. While he's been abducted, he doesn't appear to have been restrained, as he seems to be able to wander around the ship without any kind of problem. That reminded me of Star Trek The Next Generation, when the crew go onto the Borg ship for the first time and they're just largely ignored by the crew until they start messing with things. So I like to feel like this guy is just wandering about and the ship is just doing whatever it's doing. So we hear this abducted person's story as some kind of radio play. Lots of use of stereo in both the soundtrack and the use of delay on the narration to give this feeling of unease and a different time and space for the listener, which is done to fairly decent effect, I think. The use of the narration being in the present tense, I notice, I see, it gives you that impression that we're witnessing what's happening in real time, like he's talking to a dictaphone Twin Peaks style while he's exploring, or reporting back to another ship with a communicator or something. It doesn't feel like we found this as an archive piece, it's not like we picked it up off the floor and are listening back. It's much more we're there with him as he has his adventure. The atmospherics are pretty good. It feels like the kind of soundtrack you'd have in a tense movie scene today. There are these rasping synth pads that start on this edgy note. They lazily go up half a semitone and then resolve back to the bass note. It's all very classic stuff. Actually sounds a bit modern Blade Runner in a way. Those kind of long sounds that give you that feeling of epicness. You don't feel like it's a claustrophobic ship. You feel like it could be a big dome or something much larger and expansive. So I think the sound is helping to give those ideas, which is nice. And again, not always easy to do. So I think that bit is good. It's just the story itself never really captured me. It's some guy describing his experience on board a ship, but a lot of the language feels quite forced. It doesn't feel very natural. And again, it's got that slightly overwritten radio play vibes to me, which I know Hawkwind have had before and never sit right with me. You've just read from the book some of those descriptions, and for me, large black eyes that appear to have reptilian and insectile facial qualities. It's such a dispassionate way of talking about an alien. It doesn't conjure anything in my mind. It sounds very scientific, very detached. So for me, it's just meaningless sci-fi biology speak, and so it's not as evocative as I know that Hawkwind can be. So I find that a bit of a shame. I also don't like the fact that for me it goes from dispassionate to then totally incomprehensible, describing the large aliens as it's like the larvae inside the leather-faced skin of a hard, dark, scary machine, which is a terrible simile. You can't say something is like something that you've never seen before. That's not how a simile works. The whole point of a simile is to use something empathic, so I'll have a deeper idea of what you are talking about. To butcher a line from Neuromancer to make this point, the opening line is, "The sky above the port was like a television tuned to a dead channel." And while in the book it's written more as a metaphor, you can get the idea of what that tone is going to be. You get the idea that it's going to be a sci-fi world because the go-to reference is a TV. And for me, that's such a beautiful line. And that simile changes my idea of the whole atmosphere of the place that the narrator's in. If you compare that by saying the alien is like larvae inside the leather-faced skin of a dark, scary machine, I get no emotional addition because it's referencing something I've never seen before, and that's when this thing starts to completely lose me. So the narration generally leaves me quite frustrated. I also don't like the fact the story stops without a satisfactory conclusion. We're told that the robots are being brought forth to perform quote-unquote specific functions, but we're not told what those functions are or what the narrator does about it, whether or not he makes an escape or meets a sticky end or discovered this is all a big stag do prank or whatever the hell is going on. I don't know. So overall, it's a weird start to the album that leaves me largely unsatisfied, both in content and in vibe. The only thing that I do like is that feeling of a large synth wash and how that is still used to this day. So I think that they're very prescient with that, at least. But if they just played that for a bit and took all the vocals out, for me, it would be a much better track.
There speaks a man who not only writes for a living, but critiques the writing of others for a living. So this is a strange one for me because I will contradict myself several times, I'm sure. The overall effect of this is something that I quite like. The whole abduction thing, I called it abduction, didn't I? Abducted is the track name. But the overall theme of someone being abducted on the alien spaceship, I quite like. I kind of feel, yeah, this feels like Hawkwind to me as an opening. And we haven't had this for a while. So there's something comforting in that. You're right, some of the language is bizarre. And I had a line wrong. I'd been listening to it wrong for ages, and it annoyed the hell out of me. I heard something like the little ones don't bother me because they are so little.
I got exactly the same thing, and I thought that was a terrible line.
There you go. Yeah. And it ruined it for me. And I thought, I hate this line so much that I now hate everything going on around it. And then eventually I just thought, he can't be saying. And I looked it up. And then when I saw that it was blissful, then I listened and I could hear that it was blissful. And suddenly the track opened up for me a little bit. So I'm glad that I've learned that regardless. And it is strange because you're right. The language is not the language of someone in the moment describing these things. I kind of thought that it's almost like recollection. You could imagine somebody under hypnosis bringing back repressed memories might speak like this. But I don't know whether it's written to be that or whether the writing doesn't quite match the context. But the overall effect of it, I did quite like as a whole, despite there being things that I would pick at in the middle. And you're right, the tone does get slightly more hysterical as you go through it. But on the whole, a start that piqued my interest as to what would follow. And what follows is Alien I Am.
This was interesting from even just a title point of view, because this is Alien in brackets I Am, and then in square brackets Alien 4 version close brackets. And I thought that was interesting because this was happening more and more in electronic music, I think, more than other music. But definitely you found that titles would expand and expand and expand with further information, because in electronic music, for example, there was different edits or different remixes and this kind of thing. And you'd always have that information in brackets. I'd love to know if there are other versions, whether or not they just did this because it's like the language of music now. Don't really know, but maybe we'll find out when we get to the end of the decade and do a bit more backwards research like we normally do. The fact that as well it's called Alien I Am, and then the Alien 4 version has 2 N's. I never really resolved this idea about the fact that the album is Alien with more N's, but Alien is just the name of the track. And again, I never really got that.
Yeah, me neither.
Sometimes this can draw you in because you're like, oh, there's other versions. Oh, they're doing strange wordings. And sometimes you're like, I feel excluded. I don't know the other versions. I don't know why you're doing this. And for me, I think maybe it's just, again, my relationship with the album and everything, but I find this more annoying than intriguing. What's funny as well is that in Apple Music, it's typoed. So it actually says Alien 1 a.m., like the time. So for the longest time, I was wondering, why is this alien doing something at 1 a.m? And then I realized that actually that's stupid. And no, it's Alien I Am. But anyway, on to the music. There's this subtle fade from abducted to alien, so we maintain this uneasy tension from the first track to the next, and that tension's built on right away with this big mix of sparse, sinister, twangy guitar patterns over deep bassy beds and this big sustained organ chord that sounds a bit like that old THX theme when you went to the cinema. For me, it's got that kind of big build to it, so I like that a lot. This builds for like 20 seconds or so I feel like we've got this nice building feeling of atmosphere, and then we get this vocal sample from Star Trek Next Generation, which is Data talking to the Enterprise's computer about a piece of technology that's able to communicate directly with the human brain. It's a cool sample because it's both rich in detail and also devoid of any context immediately, so we're left wondering what this piece of machinery is up to. Given that it's played over this sound, probably nothing good. So I quite like it as an idea, and as a sample, the content of the words is very on point. But I wonder, because it's such a recognizable sample, that it pulls at my immersion, because my mind then inevitably starts thinking about Star Trek for a bit, and then I have to drag my concentration back to the track. Hawkwind have used samples to great effect before, and I think finding cool samples that sound cool but are unidentifiable are usually the ones that I think work the best. Like Black Elk Speaks was a great example because it was just cool and interesting, and then if you want to go find out where it is, you can go on that journey. Otherwise you can just appreciate it for something atmospheric and eerie and cool that's in the track. So it may not have been the right choice to maybe sample something as well known as something like Star Trek. But anyway, they did, and it's fine. I do feel like after that sample, the track stalls a bit with all the elements swooshing in and out. They sound good, but they don't seem to be taking us any particular direction. I think that's when my mind spins off a little bit and starts wondering about Star Trek for a bit. And it's really only after about the 1 minute mark that the band realised there should be some kind of melody happening, and we suddenly lurch into this staccato harpsichord-esque riff with the bass guitar and drums coming in to join it, and then it finally feels like we're going to kick this off properly. Then we start to hear this other voice. I'm assuming that's Ron Tree. But for me, it sounds like a Jamaican female singer. And I don't think Ron Tree is that. So whoever it is, I wasn't expecting it, but it is pretty cool. Kind of reminds me of Warrior Queen in Delivery. And anything that reminds me of Warrior Queen must be doing something right. But certainly was not expecting that. So then this mysterious voice says a bunch of creepy things like, I sleep in you and eat you from within, like some kind of parasitic wasp, and ends on this extended cry of, I am the alien. And the word alien in that Jamaican accent is very satisfying. It like hits all the vowels that bring that accent to life all in one word. So I think that's very cool, very fun to shout. And as that cry stretches on, our lead guitar appears and it feels like this track's finally ready to get going. But then it surprised me that it actually drops into this rather subdued breakdown with this soft-sounding organ and low drums for like 30 seconds before it finally gets going. That new breakdown has the lyric, we are the aliens now. So it said, I am the alien and now we are the aliens. So I was wondering whether or not the thing that goes in and eats you from within somehow changes you or something from this idea of I to we. The fact that we're being included in this definition I thought was cool. I know they later say I reject your human touch, so I assume we might still be human. Maybe we're a hybrid or something and there's a bunch more aliens that have showed up. I don't really know. It's not super clear. But again, gives you something to think about. And then 2.5 minutes of slow boil, we get into what I would call the meat of the song. And for me, it's sad that after all this build, it doesn't really do anything super compelling. For me, the riff is played well, but it feels kind of pedestrian, maybe a little over-complex on what the intro was setting up. It's a little theatrical, maybe a little soundtracky somehow. I don't feel like it has a huge amount of rockiness to be a good riff song. I feel like it's trying to almost be a bit more War of the Worlds-y again or something, you know, like it's trying to do a musical accompaniment to a story, and then the main vocal comes in to tell that story. And for me, that's also delivered a little flat. It matches the tune of the guitar, so there's some link to that and the track going on, but there's something about the way it all comes together that just leaves me feeling a little unengaged. And the lyrics are also a challenge because the rhyming feels a little basic with like emotion, devotion, find, mind. And then they have this line which is, the mind erodes away some sentimental thought, which sounds like it's about 2 words too many when they try and cram it into the bar, especially when they repeat it a lot. And I know they've done this before and it's very difficult for me to really vibe with it when they do it so obviously. But then we do drop into a part which I like the most, which is back to that spiky harpsichord sounding refrain with more of a solo-y guitar on top, while Dave and the alien kind of mumble angry threats over the top before going into this I reject your human touch cry that sounds more and more like the Daleks with every repetition. It's almost like the extraterrestrial secret agent, you know, where everything's just going crazy. And I like that. At this point, we still have another 2.5 minutes of the track to go through, but it's basically a repetition of the previous core part. So I'm going to skip that and jump to the end where our Jamaican alien comes back to remind us all that we're aliens before the track dissolves back to the organ and the bass line. Overall, I still don't feel like I really get this track. It feels like Hawkwind had the idea of the alien story and then tried to put music around it rather than the other way around, and it doesn't grab me in the same way when they arrange things like that. Historically, that hasn't really worked. So like I said before, it has a kind of secret agent style charm to it. With the added sci-fi basics thrown over it, it's okay. And while it's given me quite a lot to say right now, I guess, it's not something I expect I'll be returning to after we've done publishing this podcast.
Yeah, it's quite messy, I think, this track. So I'll preface this by saying that actually I enjoy this track. I like the fact that it's coming up and I enjoy it while it's on. I like the vocal melody in the verses. I have the same issue with you with the chorus being too wordy, which they are wont to do. But there's a certain triumphant stadiumness about the way that the verses are sung. And it certainly has to do quite a lot of work because there isn't really a riff. You wouldn't remember the riff of Alien I Am. But the vocal melody carries this for me. I like all the dialogue, but when I think about the dialogue, I then pick at it. So I tried to accept it as an atmospheric addition, because particularly when you have the voice that talks a bit and ends up saying, "We are the aliens," in a hushed voice, that to me is a terrible voice for the aliens. I want dark, booming, scary. I want shivers at that point. You would not be scared of an alien who spoke like that, because that sounds like a child with a helium balloon at a party. And they're announcing themselves by saying, "We are the aliens," which is not the first line any alien would say. To them, they are not the aliens, are they? They are whoever they are, and we are the aliens. So you could argue, couldn't you? We are the aliens. You go, no, we are the aliens. So the alien voice I found annoying, because there's a certain level of fear and trepidation in the opening spoken word piece that then goes into Alien I Am. But that has the danger of pulling me out of it. And I have to not let it pull me out of it, because actually as the song progresses, I quite like it. I enjoy it. But it doesn't carry a narrative. It doesn't tell a story. It doesn't build on what's happened. It's kind of a lot of loose concepts thrown together into a song with samples and voiceover and statements. So I have to listen to it as a one-off thing. I didn't mind the Star Trek sample. I'm a big fan of a Star Trek sample wherever they turn up. But I like the energy in it. And it feels again like this is Hawkwind doing what Hawkwind can do. Maybe not the very best that Hawkwind can do, but I'm definitely along for the ride by this point. And we get to having our human touch rejected, Matt.
Yeah, it's weird that in the previous song we have the lyric, "I reject your human touch," and then this track is called "Reject Your Human Touch," but that's fine. It's another smooth transition from one track to the next, and we open with this really nice bass line. For me, it's got that Love in Space vibe, which I really like. You know, it's twangy and rubbery with this slight modulation on the volume, almost like a sidechain compression, which just gives it that fast head nod quality. I find that super groovy. And when the drums come in, it does that trick where it changed where I thought the downbeat was going to be. Like I'm nodding in one way, and then when it hits, it's actually slightly further along. And I always like it when they do that, because that's clever and not easy to do. So well played there. We just sit in this groove for a little bit, really. It's slowly layering some more synthetic strings and a lazy guitar over the top of it. And it slowly builds in intensity until we have this really nice groove salad going on. It's the first time I felt some real artistry in the album. For me, it's a shame that it's only a few minutes long, because I would love a little more of this. And maybe people who didn't hear White Zone, this is their first time hearing it, and I'm hoping that they enjoyed it, because it's definitely some of the learnings from that coming down into this. I feel like it's more of a coda to the previous track than a track in its own right. You know, usually I'd wonder why they didn't make Alien 2.5 minutes longer, but this way I get to skip Alien and just enjoy this bass line, so I'm very much behind this decision. It's a nice track, it's very short, it's very musically accomplished. I like this one. Even though it is small, it's probably the first time I myself start having fun in this album.
Interesting. I also like this track. It feels like it's well placed. We've had the big spoken word opener. We've had a bit of rock. It's now time to go back and do one of those little instrumental things that Hawkwind do and do quite well. So yeah, I'm with you. It doesn't overstay its welcome, but it does its job quite nicely. And it seems like, as you say, with the transition, that this idea of actually having a concept album where these tracks are blending into each other, even if the material isn't a direct link in terms of there being a narrative and a journey, they're all kind of concepts thrown together. The fact that the music fits seamlessly together helps the idea of it therefore being a concept album, if that makes sense. So I quite like that part of the journey. And it takes us to, for me, one of the higher points of the album, which is Blue Skin. So we're about to find out just how far apart we might be, Matt.
I'm going to have to say, Andy, I think we are astronomically far apart. No, I'm afraid the other side of the 7-minute sandwich that surrounds Reject Your Human Touch, I think I can put next to Void City as some of the worst Hawkwind tracks I've ever heard, I'm afraid. It's just a very strange track for me. There's obviously a fade from the previous track into Blueskin, but we crash into this Blueskin track very quickly with this sci-fi laser blast sound, and then the drums and the bass are hot on the heels of that. And for me, it's got the Void City issue that for all of its ingredients, its speed and paper thinness makes it very tedious. I mean, the drums are galloping along with lots of rumble and speed, and there's this like 2-note synth pattern which is keeping up the pace, and then there's this main refrain with its raspy and abrasive sound. Sounds like it might be a stylophone or something, but when it all comes together, for me it doesn't feel cohesive at all. It feels like all the parts are running alongside each other but are being kept apart by big barriers. There's not so much of an audio mix as more of just an audio pile, and they don't feel like any of the bits talk to each other or work with each other. It all feels like a big cluttered mass of stuff rather than a nice mix of things. And then we have these half whispered vocals on top that come in, and they seem to be what's going to be making this track last for 7 minutes, but they mumble indistinctly, scream, moan and hiss about what seems to be some kind of alien tattoo tagging device that puts a bunch of information onto your face. Why, we're left to guess, but tagging people historically has never been done for altruistic reasons, so we can assume that there's some kind of alien abduction, slavery or segregation at hand in this story, but I don't really care much about it because of the way it's delivered. It all just feels very insipid and therefore doesn't really bring me in, and I feel like I'm more on the other side of a room looking at this track rather than in it, and I think I said before in Electric Teepee there were a couple of tracks which I really felt like I was in the track and the track was almost spinning around me, and they can be really immersive, but this one somehow I feel like I'm just looking at the pieces of it. I'm seeing the trees rather than the wood in terms of actually trying to see how this track works.
You're seeing the wrong tree.
Seeing the wrong trees as well, yeah. There is this little break 3 minutes in where Talkie Dave comes in to add some specifics to this story. The fact that name, age, place of birth, race, village and tribe are all carved onto people's faces. I know this isn't the point, but it sounds like a lot of information to put on someone's face. There's not that much real estate on a face. I know artists like 6ix9ine and Post Malone are probably going to argue with that, but the whole thing sounds slightly ridiculous to me, and then that further takes me out of the track. Also, the fact that they tattoo age always gets me because age changes. Do people go for an annual tattoo update? Do they have their age put in like how prisoners do time sentence on their cells? They just have that kind of stick and gate thing, and as you get older you just get more and more lines and you have to try and count them. I don't know, the whole thing seems a bit ridiculous. And then the track just crashes back in and I just roll my eyes and just wait for it to stop, to be honest. At that point I'm really over it.
The funny thing is, about 75% of what you said is exactly what I would have said, but I would have said it in a kind of a jaunty, upbeat tone. I quite like the mess that this track is, and I quite like the ride with all of its bumps and flaws. Again, there is the thing which is definitely a theme of this album for me, is that there are just lots of loosely not fitting fun ideas in the moment that are kind of thrown together into the blender, rather than there being a coherent through line to anything. But one thing leads to the next, leads to the next. But once I've given up on that and just kind of accept that in a minute's time there will be another random thing from X-Files chucked in, I kind of just ride with it. So Blueskin does that for me, and I enjoy that. And to me, it's not quite as insane as Beam Me Up.
Beam Me Up is in a slightly difficult position because Blueskin leaves me in a weird mood after hearing it, and that obviously doesn't necessarily set Beam Me Up for success, but as soon as the track starts after Blueskin, I always laugh because it just feels so cheesy with this low slung bass line and drums that are a fraction of the tempo of the previous track. It's somewhere between seedy and ridiculous, but without the self-awareness to be fun, like a Matt Berry song or something, Then the vocals come in to seal the deal for me that this is going to be a ridiculous track. They're so overperformed, like they're trying for a late 70s vibe, but for me it's coming across as a bit silly. It's singing complete nonsense in this overly laboured way. And then when I think this track couldn't get any weirder, we have this whole I'm being beamed up riser, which then explodes into another Hawkwind clown car section for the 90s for me. It just goes completely insane, that we know they can do and have done, but have not done for a while, so maybe they were due one, and this is it. Not only that, but they've managed to combine the clown carness with the McDonald's hamburger non sequitur rant about bombs for a moment before it remembers what album it's on and then goes back into a spacey breakdown, which actually sounds pretty good. That's got a nice synth voice in it with some nice texturing on it. It's got some nice drones, and like the bass range is quite nice, and it all complements each other quite nicely. And there's a sound like space dolphins, which is quite nice. And then I'm assuming we're going to another track, but no, suddenly the same track comes in, but it's got bored and decided it would rather do Spirit of the Age for a minute, which at this point I'm thinking, sure, why not? You've tried everything else in this track, why not throw that in as well? And the fact that this guy keeps singing I'm being beamed up, I'm just left thinking, can this ship beam him up any faster so we can just get this track over with? This is like the slowest tractor beam I've ever heard a spaceship have. This is like the 1-2 punch of some kind of crazy Hawkwind id-ness with Blue Skin and Beam Me Up together. They're both strange stories delivered in a very strange way. You feel like they are Hawkwind somehow. You know, it's still them, but it's just not what I find compelling for them. And again, it feels a little messy and a little silly, a little haphazard. It feels a little what they were and not what they are.
No, and I feel that Beam Me Up was always going to struggle for you after Blue Skin. I find Beam Me Up to be quite a hard listen, but I'm obviously coming off the back of a much more enjoyable experience with Blue Skin than you had, so I'm more disappointed than angry about Beam Me Up. It's over 4 minutes, and like as a 1 minute little interstitial thing, I could have gone with it, but it goes on for too long and the voice becomes far too manic for me. And I think Ron Tree's voice is better when there is less drama in it. The voice for me is actually pretty solid, but when he really starts bringing the dramatics in, I think it can go off the wall. So I struggle a little bit with Beam Me Up. And actually, I start with Beam Me Up thinking that it's going to be okay, but then it just doesn't become what I want it to become and kind of goes off in these different things and then comes back again. And yes, it's a tricky one. I'm not a skipper of tracks, particularly when tracks are blending into each other. It breaks up the flow far too much to do it. But if I was, I would probably be skipping Beam Me Up.
I don't know anything about Ron Tree, and I don't know if he was compared to Calvert before or just because he happens to be in this band, or whether or not because he was compared and heard himself being compared to it, he felt like he had to try and be Calvert-y. But this almost could be seen as someone trying to do a Calvert impression, which is dangerous because it wasn't an act for Calvert. At least it never sounded like it. It sounded like, you know, that's who he was, and everything, even the bits where it was really mental, sounded still like they were coming from a place of maximum integrity because it was who he is. And trying to replicate that when you're not that is really difficult, right? Because you can only be a fraction of it, and you're going to be called out. Do you know what I mean? It's like you're not going to get the same feeling. You're either not going to do it justice because it's impossible to, or you're just going to be told, oh, you're doing like that guy who was good. You know, I feel like either way, you're kind of damned. Yeah,
it's really interesting point. Definitely he is compared to Calvert a lot in the books by people who are around. Whether he was before is a really interesting question. Obviously, he gets into the band by badgering Dave and going, look, I can do this, I can do this. And then they obviously did it. And Dave and the band went, yeah, that's cool, let's do that. But it's interesting in as much as, and someone might point out an exception here, but on the whole, no one in Hawkwind is ever replaced by someone who is remotely like them. There's never a callback to the past in terms of the people that come into the band, which is one of the most brilliant things about the band. And maybe Ron is being himself entirely, and it's just unfortunate that that comparison gets made, because obviously Calvert is one of the most well-loved characters in Hawkwind and a brilliant wordsmith, nutso performer, and has his own particular post-punk vocal styling. And you maybe would be better off just trying to not make the comparison, but the music makes you make the comparison because of what's being done. But I do think if he was a little bit more contained in some of the stuff, I think it would come across a lot better. It becomes a bit amdram sometimes, and that's when it's at its worst. And I don't really remember Calvert doing that.
At least not on record. It sounds like he might have done it live, but you feel like it's very listen-toable in the album.
Exactly. Yeah, and I do think there's a lot said about Ron Tree as a live performer. Hawkwind being like a three-piece and behind banks of keyboards and stuff, and there not being a show, which obviously early 70s Hawkwind, the show was a massive integral part of what Hawkwind were. And he brings that, and I can hear in this music that this would be very interesting to see him performing this live. And actually then the more dramatic stuff would probably come across a lot better in a live setting. So, you know, there's that too, which is an interesting aspect. This, of course, Matt, brings us to the milestone moment that separates Matt really, really struggling and maybe there being some light at the end of the tunnel. We come to some super chill with Vega.
Yeah, every time I've listened to this album for this show, I put it on, grit my teeth, and wait for Vega.
That's a t-shirt.
Vega is a return to sanity for me. It's not really doing anything that previous Hawkwind ambient pieces haven't already done, but it's very accomplished. It's sonically satisfying, and compared to everything else so far, it's a return to my Hawkwind. It feels like a more peaceful wave upon wave from Business of the Future. It lacks the bass depth or the subterranean booms that track has, or the glistening bleeps that lived in the high register, but also it doesn't need them because it has its own serene, flowing feel that's secure enough to take its time and slowly unfold over a few minutes. And towards the end, we do get a hint at a more watery sound, like when you drop a microphone in water to get that slight feeling of beach surf. It's very subtle, but it's there, so you do feel like there might be some aquatic themes lying on from previous albums. For me, Vega is my palate cleanser. It's a mental piece of pickled ginger between sushi courses in this album. It's arguably an unremarkable track that's made all the more interesting by the context of what's come before it. It is a solid B+ ambient piece out of context, but on this album, it's an oasis that I really, really need. It also marks a turning point for me in the direction of the album in general, for the better.
It's really interesting because I feel very similarly about this, but there's several interesting things about this that came to me when I looked at the credits, because this is credited to Alan Davey. Now, when I said there was a little bit of a tug of war with the band wanting to be much more electronic and Alan wanted to bring back some of the rock, this is Alan. The next one is Ron and Alan Davey. The next one is Brock and Alan Davey. And then Sputnik Stan is Alan Davey. And then Kapal is Brock, Chadwick and Davey. So there's a shift actually in who's generating the material, which is interesting. You having picked up Vega as your palate cleanser before things take a bit of an upturn with the album. It's interesting that looking at the credits, there's quite a big shift in who is doing that. To me, those first 5 tracks are kind of a piece. A lot of tracks that follow Vega are just not a part of it, which is fine. That's not a criticism at all. Those first 5 pieces probably stretch it about as far as you can. I enjoy Vega. It takes me back to Electric Teepee in terms of the sound. The sound of Electric Teepee was much deeper and boomier than what we then got on It Is the Business of the Future to Be Dangerous. And this harkens back to me more to the Electric Teepee sound. So we get the Ron Tree and Alan Davey penned Xenomorph.
If you were going to do a hard crimp of this album, if this intro was a touch longer, it could almost be the start of the album for me.
Interesting.
It comes out of Vega with this pretty mystical sounding synth ARP for about 10 seconds, and then there's a snare hit and we drop into this much more deserty feeling space rock piece. And I feel like if that little ARP was maybe like 3 times as long, you could settle in for it and then go. It sounds like it's going to be a bit of a downer in tone with the first guitar chord, which feels very minor and a bit Sabbathy, but then it pulls itself out of this mood with the next chord, which feels much more major and optimistic. And when we get into the full riff about 20 seconds in, I feel like we're set up to be a pretty pacey little rock number. The lyrics are still kind of weird, but they fit with the general theme of the album thus far. They jump from more elongated delivery over the driving rock to a faster, more intense delivery when the drums turn into that more double-time fill style, so the track has this nice push and pull to itself, which keeps interest and helps drive the piece along. The theme of the song seems to be about an evil alien that can possess or in some way take control of people. So that's very much on theme. You're not being so much abducted from your location via a spaceship as maybe your body is being abducted by another presence which is able to take control of you. So I still think it fits. I like the line, skeletal life forms born to be my toys. It gives that feeling that there's a degree of malice in this act, you know, like we're becoming obedient playthings for this antagonistic alien. So I think that's cool.
Yes, I agree.
I'm glad that you agree.
I do agree.
The lyrics, they're a little hard to fully grasp, and the delivery is a little overdone in places perhaps, but so far it's one of the more coherent stories I feel like we've had. Again, I like the phrase counterfeit android, even if I don't really understand what it means. I was wondering whether or not it meant something like we're acting like androids because we don't have autonomy anymore, but because we used to be human but we were possessed, we're like androids but not, maybe. But either way, it's an interesting use of two words together. And I like the little spikes of feedback and strumminess on the guitar. There's that little feeling where there's a little burst of sound, and it just adds some humanity and a few rough edges to what otherwise has been potentially a quite by the numbers sound in terms of the production. So I do like that feeling that this is being played, and not only played, maybe played with a little bit of intensity in order to get those little rough edges, which is nice. And we end on this line, you will have to escape through the tunnel of light, which I also think is a cool way of saying that death is the only way this ends once the Xenomorph has you on its radar. So I think, again, that's a very poetic way of saying something sinister. So this has some of that Hawkwind poetry or sideways looking at things, which I was hoping for again in this, which is very welcome for me. And also, halfway through the track, we break out into this other section, which isn't a full breakdown, as we still have the drums driving us forward, but the switch of instrumentation is very slick. We go from slightly distorted guitar to what sounds like a piano with some shimmery reverb on it, and it creates a lot of space and takes some of the air out of the track without affecting the structure, in exactly the opposite of Blueskin, which is very nice for me. Then this piano starts to become a kind of anchoring element as the other instrumentation rolls back in. So then you feel like we've come back for a much larger crescendo as the rhythm guitar is replaced with the more solo-y guitar, the bass is back, and the drums add more cymbals and hats. So we're building up in this intensity, which I really like. And then we find ourselves hurtling towards the end of the track. And just as it looks like we might be headed for disaster, we roll into this half-speed take and neatly resolve ourselves out into Journey. So for me, this is the first track I can really properly get into as a nice Hawkwind space rock jam. It's not fully shaken off the trappings of the first 5 tracks with the slightly difficult lyrics, but overall, for me, it's much more enjoyable. And after the break that is Vega, this is the first track that really starts to energize me for the post-Vega half of the album.
It's definitely, I can't remember if you used the word coherence, but coherent is the right word, particularly from the words and the story point of view. The other tracks I talked about having lots of 1990s conspiracy, alien abduction, sci-fi things all thrown into the blender together. This one has a concept and sticks with it throughout, and the words reflect that. It would be easy to look at this and think that these are Ron Tree's words and Alan Davies' music, but Ron Tree being a bass player turned singer, there may be a little bit more collab on both sides than that, so I don't want to do them an injustice. But yes, this does feel like you could listen to this as a song in its own right outside of the scope of the album and it would work. And as you say, when pieces come back in, they come back in with context in terms of where they're placing the tracks. It's not just a repeat of an earlier piece. As you say, it needed a bit of rockiness back in the mix after Blueskin, Beam Me Up, Vega. So it's well placed, I think, on the album. Yeah, it does a good job for me and is a welcome track to come at this point. And as you say, leads us seamlessly into Journey, which is actually Dave and Alan collaborating.
And another Alien with too many ends version for us to wonder how many other journeys there are.
Yes. I've never seen another one, so who knows?
Who does? Well, the Alien 4 Journey is our first foray into real stereo land as well, with this intro synth bed which flanks us from the right at the beginning of the track before this more stabby keyboard refrain comes in from both channels. So maybe we are in a journey into stereo. But I like that as an intro. I think it's nice. Also, maybe stabby isn't quite the right word for those keys. It's more plinky. It's not really that either. It's somewhere between stabby and plinky. That's where we are. guitar. These short notes without this sense of aggression, but they're still quite short. But if you combine stabby and plinky, you get stinky, which isn't quite what I was going for. So I'm not quite sure how to describe this. But after the stinky keyboard arrives, we break into this very wonky feeling track. It's slow in speed, but it feels very swung with all these stinky notes skipping around the kick and snare for this very minimal drum kit funk. And it kind of knocks you off balance given everything we've heard so far, but it's really interesting and it really switches me up every time I hear it. And for me, it really starts to mentally distance itself from the previous pieces, which I really welcome. The track builds itself up to this feeling where we have this sporadic bass guitar plonks and this lazy electric guitar which starts to fill in the gaps left by this more staccato instrumentation. So we start to fill our sound spectrum up again, but in a much more harmonious and satisfying way, while still keeping this illicit jank that we've got going on. And once we've established all the elements, we're pretty much done, but in a good way. You know, there's little bursts of static and noise to add just some extra interest and some little random oscillations, but they're just incidental milestones on our journey, which is very much staying the course now it's got into its stride. And we've got a slight B section for a few bars, but again, it's just a little detour on our journey, a nice little rest stop before we get back on the path, to use lots of journey similes. It's a nice little thing. It's not an ambient interlude. It's more like something we get in the 70s, like Opa Loca or something, you know, a little bit more of an experiment. But I like what they've done with it, and it's always nice to hear Hawkwind break out of the 4/4 patterns, especially when we know that they are doing a lot of programming and, you know, they are moving MIDI notes around and they can be exacting. So when they do actually something which is a little bit more broken and has a little bit more skip in its step, you feel like they aren't just limited to the 4/4 machine patterns. They can break out of it, and I think when they do, they're very good at it. So there's some nice rhythmic accomplishment here, which just gives us this very strange but welcome piece.
Yes, and you used the term illicit jank. That's what this track will always mean to me now. It feels definitely like it's come out of a studio jam. I mean, maybe they all do, who knows? Hawkwind obviously do a lot of jamming and work in the studio, but this one definitely feels that way. And I like tracks where you begin kind of sparse and then you're filling it in and things are building up and becoming more intense. It's definitely a structure that I really like from a lot of different bands and a lot of different contexts. So yeah, this one fills in very nicely. It sits between two quite aggressive tracks as well. It is the filler in the aggressive track sandwich on this album, but it does segue from Xenomorph very, very nicely to take us to Sputnik Stan, which for me would be my standout, just to give the game away. Sputnik Stan.
Yeah, it's very much a case of, oh, hello, Hawkwind, where have you been this whole album? I kid. But for me, this is a track that I gravitate to for all the things I like the band for. So I'm very much in agreement with you. And I don't think anyone who's listening to this podcast would expect anything different. So I think we might as well admit it that, yes, this is a very, very cool track. It's a return to a more traditional rock sound with a very Hawkwind style. It's got that really nice Hawkwind style space banality story thrown over the top of it. And I am here for it. After a short ambient handover between Journey and this, we thump our way into the track with this big fast drum beat and aggressively strummed guitar, which puts us in this classic rocker mode straight away. But it still sounds a little bit sinister. For the first few bars, while we're still getting up to speed, we feel like, oh, okay, this isn't going to be necessarily an anthem. It might be a story, but it still sounds a bit gritty. And when we break into the chorus without any ceremony, we're just straight into this. It's just got that very driving feel to it. And then, you know, we switch up into this more classic sound that takes me back to the 70s, early 80s sort of do-re-mi Sonic Attack style. So overall, with that mix of do-re-mi fuzz and levitation serenity, there's this really nice place that it sits with a bit of a rough edge, but also with this quite nice chord progression that's more uplifting than sinister. So it's got the speed, it's got the content, it's got the timbres that set it up to be a bit of a hit, I think. It might even fit into the Damnation Alley Death Trap vibe of the story of a person told over music that feels more happy about the situation than you think they should be. So I think that's always fun. We haven't had one of those in a while. Although we do actually then have one later on in this album, which we will get to. Yeah. But I think this is the superior one, because this story has Hawkwind's anarchic imagination running all the way through it. We hear the tale of the titular Sputnik Stan, who is essentially an intergalactic garbage man who orbits the Earth collecting all the space junk so it doesn't get in the way of any spaceships that are coming or going. So again, it has that idea of space banality. There might be alien ships abducting people, but there are also people who have to keep space clean. So we get this story from the Spaceways maintenance man, which leads us to assume that there are maybe agreed routes for entering and exiting Earth's atmosphere when abducting people. It's a bit like running into some high-speed orbital debris is not acceptable, like hitting a pothole on the M1, you know. So I like the idea that there's some kind of space lanes in Earth for these people to keep clear. He also says in a spoken piece towards the end that he's been commissioned by the Alien Federation to collect all the junk and don't think about trying to nick any of it because it's all his. And while the name of the album is Alien 4, and we've been talking about aliens for most of this album, if you take this track out of context and couple it with the way the lines are delivered, it almost sounds like Sputnik Stan is just a crazy person on the side of the road with a pair of those grabby claw things that people use to pick up trash, and he's just made up this whole story that he must collect all the aluminium cans he sees in order to appease the worm god that lives in his head or whatever. So it could be a tale about a maintenance man in space, or it could be the tale of a bearded weirdo who the council's long given up on. So I do like the fact it could work either way.
Yep. And quite presently, actually, I don't know what the scene was in 1995, but now junk orbiting Earth is actually a massive, massive problem. And in fact, there are orbits basically that spaceships get moved out to, and dangerous orbits where you shouldn't go because there's too much flying around. So yeah, quite present really. This is joyous, and the music kind of sweeps you along, and the lyrics are delivered in that style as well. And it has memorable pieces in there, like They Call Me Sputnik Stan, Spaceway Maintenance Man. This is a lot easier to remember and smile as you recite it than some of the really wordy things that you get before, or things that you're not quite sure what the words are and to look them up. This is definitely a joy, and there are a few tracks from the 90s that are in Hawkwind's live set and have been in the times that we've been seeing them. I would love for them to do this. This would fit the band very, very well. So yeah, Sputnik Stan, very, very good indeed. Very happy with that.
As you were saying about the debris and the fact that there is a hazard out there, I was thinking about the film Gravity.
Yes.
You know, how one thing blows up and then makes everything else blow up. And I was thinking, like, if Sputnik Stan was there, he would be watching that going, I'm going to need a bigger skip.
Yeah.
But, you know, we were talking about the story, and the story's only 18 lines, and it's a 7-minute long track.
Yep.
So there's actually a lot of instrumental parts of this track as well. It made me feel like it's almost a kind of jazz, because you know how classic jazz ensembles start with a refrain that they all know,
yep,
and then they all wander off for a bit and do their own thing, and then they come back to end on that same refrain to tie it all together. It almost does the same thing with the vocals. You know, they start the track and they end the track, but in the middle there's this whole sonic universe to explore. After the first verse ends and the music takes over, we really start to get the feel for actually how fast this track's going. The drums aren't doing a lazy breakbeat or even a classic rock beat. It's a real driving affair. Every quarter note is punctured by this bang, 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 by this muffled snare drum, which keeps the pace, but it's also staying in its lane sonically. So I feel like a harsher snare would have cut through everything. So I really think that was a good decision to actually have something that's keeping the pace, but at the same time isn't being over percussive. It's just driving things along, and the riff goes under the vocals really nicely. It's almost a bit surfy. That's where I kind of get the Levitation vibe a little bit. It feels a bit anthemic, and there's a lot of treble in it, which makes it feel like it's not down in the dumps. You know, it's very positive, even though it's a little frantic. And when the vocals end and we lose some of that information in the upper register, they have this more buzzy vibe to the bass, which helps switch up the riff as well. So it makes it simple and driving, but there's always this steady home chord, which we come back to. So I do feel like it has this jammy style to it, but also there is this nice feeling that we are coming back like a broken centrifuge. You know, we're spinning around, but we are also orbiting around one core idea. And there's this glistening programmed synth sequence over the guitars and bass, and it's very faint, but it does just enough to remind you that we're in space, which I think is really, really nice. And when the band dropped the intensity of everything around 2.5 minutes or something, there's this really nice part where like the bass is again really, really swung, which gives a lot of pace to it, a little bit like Journey, but nowhere near as Journey because it's more groovy, but it still has a really nice swing to it. And then the whole jam around it's really nice. But then there's a point when the drums change into this more traditional rock beat without losing any of the intensity. And then we get this washed out surfy guitar come to just wail over it for a while, which is really, really fun. And then we drop the intensity again by about 50% over the course of about half a minute. And I was wondering when I was first listening to this, like, what are we building up to? And then out of nowhere, we suddenly switch up into this half-speed breakdown with this heavenly synth voice coming in over the drum and bass. And it's impossible to describe how satisfying that synth voice is for me. It's soft, but it's bright. It's glassy. It's ethereal. It's like the sound that sun rays that shine out of clouds on a overcast day would sound like if they made sound, you know? I don't think probably since Steppenwolf have I been so positively taken back by a Hawkwind mid-track breakdown. So while this is a great story and a great jam, that little breakdown in the middle, I get excited about knowing it's going to come. I've been walking my dog and literally just waving my fist around because it's so good. It's a real highlight. It's a highlight on a highlight for me, you know, and for me, it just pushes that track from good to really great.
It reminds me of your reaction to Damnation Alley.
Yes.
Yeah, so really great. I agree with all of that. There's no coincidence that this is the track that I would remember when looking at the album cover and thinking, I don't know any of this. Oh yeah, that one. That's on here, isn't it? That takes us to Kapal.
We start Kapal with some Hawkwind birds, which we haven't heard in a while, but are always welcome. And these sound more tropical than the seagulls we normally get, and there's a slight delay effect on them and some stereo panning to make them sound more trippy. So it's not your granddad's Hawkwind birds, it's the contemporary Hawkwind birds of the 90s. So that's fun. So we got this bird ambience for about a minute before we go into this sort of atonal guitar soundscape with swirling noise ambience and snatched pieces of instrumentation, which is fine. But they also have a sample of a Shakespeare performance, namely that scene from Hamlet, To Be or Not to Be. And if you want my opinion on the sample, please refer back to my Star Trek sample reaction previously in this podcast. I don't think it's a good use of content because, again, it makes me think about Shakespeare and not about the track. But after 2 minutes of Birds and Shakespeare, we finally get into what might be seen as the core of the track with this looped synth bass line and some vaguely eerie strung out chords. But even those attempts at instrumentation are polluted by more Shakespeare ramblings and the whining, hissing sounds of a fully hydraulic machine that puts me in mind of the power loader from Alien 2. So I find this track very hard to get into, and whenever this track is able to like dig itself out from under all the stuff the band has piled on it, it's a fairly basic little loop. I guess I would give it a solid okay, but for me it's nothing more than that. And after Sputnik Stan, it's not taking the energy or the inspiration or the class really for me. This feels a little bit of a road bump between this and then Festivals, which is another like big piece. I wonder whether or not going from Sputnik Stan to Festivals might have been too much, but maybe I would like to have tried it. I don't think Kapal's doing much by being here or being anything really.
Yeah, it's all right, Kapal. I don't mind it. Similarly, I guess, to Blue Skin, the pylon of stuff didn't worry me quite as much. It's not as good at doing what it does as either Vega or Journey are at doing what they do. And this point in the album is an interesting place for it to be. And I say that because actually tracks 11, 12, 13, 14 and 15 are not tracks that have anything to do with aliens or abduction. And they feel like if this was a box set, these last 5 tracks that we're about to get to would be part of the bonus material or a special extra disc or something like that. Because the album, in terms of its theme, begins with Abducted and ends with Kapal. Although Kapal doesn't have vocals in it, it's kind of how it feels to me, those 11 tracks. And at that point, Kapal isn't a particularly great closer. And I know it isn't a closer because there's 5 tracks to come, but the way that I've sectioned it in my head, I'd have done something slightly different. So it's in a strange place for me where it is following Sputnik Stan. And I might even have just put it after Journey and then allowed Sputnik Stan to be the big stadium punch the air moment to close out. So I don't mind it. It's not one I would particularly remember or come back to, but I wouldn't skip it either. It's perfectly fine. It's longer than I thought it was at 5 minutes, and probably 3 would do. Which brings us to the first of those tracks that are kind of unrelated. And in some of these tracks, some of them are re-recordings or reworkings of previous tracks. So we come to those. It's interesting that they would find their way on. This one, Festivals, is actually credited to Dave Brock and Chris Tate. Chris Tate, who had become Mrs. Brock in time, and is definitely a response by Dave Brock to what's happening in the festival scene. So it's completely lifted away from any aliens and space. So what did you make of this one, Matt?
I must admit, at first I dismissed this as some basic Hawkwind rock, but as I started to pay more attention to the latter half of the album, this one has increased in profundity for me. This is, in actuality, an angry eulogy for the end of the free festival scene delivered in a Days of the Underground style, which, like Days of the Underground, the lyrics are able to both inform me about the topic and make me empathise with their side of it at the same time. So I think it's actually a very accomplished track. While the rhyming structure might first appear simplistic, the rapidness of the delivery and the content of the words hide a very well thought out rant that's much more powerful than the lyric sheet might actually suggest. Lines like "we came in peace but left in war" makes me feel like the band were driven out from something they really loved and were forced out rather than leaving voluntarily, which is, both a depressing story to tell and also, for the first time in this album, an alien reference, actually like the whole "we came in peace" reference. So it's not about aliens, but I think in a way it is using an alien reference, which I think is neat and actually somehow cleverer than most of the alien references they use for actual alien stuff. And the line "everyone is guilty though not everyone is bad" is also really great. Makes me feel like they're attacking people from their complicitness in the downfall of the festival scene, even if they didn't do it on purpose. They just didn't fight to keep it alive or stop the infiltration from the inside, which the band laments in previous lyrics. So it's kind of damning people with faint praise, which is, if you really want to wound someone, that's how you do it, So I do think everything has been done really nicely in this. And the whole thing comes across as Hawkwind's angry exit interview from a scene that they clearly loved at first, but saw it twist and change into something they could no longer recognize or feel they could be part of, which is very sad. And the whole story's told over a very accomplished and varied musical score, which, like Sputnik Stan, feels oddly upbeat considering the story being told. And I was wondering if they did that in an almost like reminding the people they left, this is what you lost. You could have had us sounding like this, but you don't get to. While they're lamenting, they're not lamenting in a Days of the Underground, this sucks. There's a rebellious spirit to it. They're like an FU to people rather than a, oh, we're sad, which I think is an interesting and probably healthy attitude in a way to something that if you feel like you're being cast out, you at least need to feel like you're the one doing the walking and you're not the one being abandoned. The instrumentation leaves a lot of room for the vocals to shine through, with one interesting addition that there's what sounds like an old school rave sample in there, that high-pitched siren. I have very early 90s rave records that have that sound in them, so I think it is a sample or they found a way to recreate it on their synth. Maybe it's a preset, I don't know, but either way, it makes this little blippy sound like someone's resetting it, but when you actually get to the end of the lines, they take the finger off the reset button and it becomes this dramatic riser that takes over from the vocals, giving this sense of dramatic continuity from the lyrical parts, which I think is a really interesting counterpoint to the vocals, and it's a really cool choice to maintain that intensity, which I really like. The vocals of the verses are delivered in this sort of shouted monotone, which we've heard before from the band, and it works in a very take me seriously kind of way. So I think that delivery is actually really, really nicely done. The choruses are a bit more sung, but in this sort of semi-wistful way, so it still sounds sad but not melodramatic. It's not like Who's Gonna Win the War, it still carries this feeling of documentary over story, while still offering other musical counterpoints to the verses. So I think that's really, really nice as well. And at the end of the choruses, there's this really cool descending riff that again sounds a little wistful and glum without sounding overly dramatic. So again, it's keeping this feeling that it wants to be genuine without going over the top. And the bass line offers a musical counterbalance to keep the intensity as well, which is really nice. Every verse is another chapter in the downfall of the scene, recounted in this vaguely resigned way. So this story builds between speedy instrumentation sections and a few resonant guitar noodles and then hard truths, and then we go again. There's even what sounds like a Black Elk Speak sample in the fourth or fifth post-chorus instrumental piece, which is interesting. The whole thing is something which I definitely slept on at the beginning, but this one that definitely repeat listenings has really helped turn it from something which I thought was okay into something which I actually really like. I thought We Came in Peace but Left in War at the beginning was actually really cheesy, but now I really like it as this nice lament condensed down into one line. Like they were invited with open arms but were driven out under pressure and persecution and they're mad about it. And considering that we've talked about free festivals before, in the canon albums, they haven't really come up. We know that they've met people from it. People have come in, people have gone out, and I'm sure there'd be more of it if we did every single album that they ever do, and, we'll come back to that. So as someone who is very much just following the studio canon albums without veering from that, it's nice to finally have an account of this that has been chronicled, because I feel like as a listener who can only peek at the history through what snatches I get from you in order to remain as quote-unquote impartial as I can, I was very glad as a listener to have this, because I felt like it told me a lot, but also it sounds great as well. So for me, this is a really nice track and a surprising highlight towards the end of the album.
You've beautifully put all that I think about this track. We're definitely of one mind. Chris Tate, I believe, wrote the words for this. So well done, Chris. Yeah, I love this. And I love social commentary from Hawkwind. Sometimes it's hidden within science fiction metaphor. Sometimes it's slightly more upfront. But whenever they do it really well. There can be a perception, not least by me sometimes, of Hawkwind being quite an escape in terms of space and the logbook and Chronicle of the Black Sword and all of these different things. But actually, when they do speak about things closer to home, they do it so well, and generally always have done. I go back to something like High Rise on PXR5 or Psychedelic Warlords Disappear in Smoke or tracks from Sonic Attack. They do it beautifully, and this is a great track. And it took me several listens to get it because it doesn't feel like a continuation of Alien 4. It feels like a completely separate thing that's been put in. But once I fell into a mindset of thinking of Alien 4 as abducted to Kapal and then detaching the other tracks from it, I found that I came to it just as a standalone piece in its own right. And I liked it even before, and I loved it afterwards. And its 6, nearly 7-minute time does not feel like that at all. It races along. And like you, I think the delivery absolutely nails the words. They fit together, the vocal melody, the way it's delivered, the pace of it. Yeah, so I love this track very much. Track 12 feels interesting in terms of the conversation about comparisons between Ron Tree and Robert Calvert. If you don't want to compare Ron Tree to Robert Calvert, you don't re-record Robert Calvert songs with Ron Tree. But at the same time, maybe they thought, you sound like Robert Calvert, let's do a Calvert song, and that makes complete sense. Or maybe they were playing it live, because again, I can imagine live it would sound killer, Ron Tree doing Calvert stuff. Putting it on record is a bold move.
Yeah, and this is the first time when putting Alien 4 version in brackets makes sense, because this is the Alien 4 iteration of Hawkwind doing a version of the PXR5 classic. That's why I was wondering about the other ones, like, are there other versions? Is this a thing? I don't know, but this one makes sense to me. This one is tricky to label outright because the sound of this version is much better. I think the guitar is more growly and more drawn out. The sound is thicker and meaner. It feels like it could rattle some skeletons if played on a large sound system, which is cool. And I actually went back and listened to the original version on PXR5, which I do like, but after listening to this and listening to that, the original does sound quite thin. It has quite a lot of silence in it in a way. The audio spectrum is not taken care of in the same way that it is here. So that is arguably an improvement. But the new vocal style in this version, I'm not a huge fan of. I like the more hysterical chorus style of the original, and I feel like that added some nice audio context to the story we were hearing and drew you into this idea that it's an account of someone in their death trap. And this version for me sounds more measured, more in control, which doesn't feel like the best way of getting across the feeling of this track. The delivery I don't feel really matches the style of playing either. It leaves the vocals feeling quite flat. They feel almost a bit whispered or held back somehow, where I feel like they need to be screamed over the noise of the Death Trap machine as it makes its struggles to progress over the scorched wasteland it finds itself in, and this feels much more sedate. I feel like the actual chorus, for example, suffers from this a lot. I want to feel I can shout along with the simple punky chorus, and in this version I get no rise in energy. In fact, if anything, for me it goes down and becomes more husky. I feel like in the second verse they try and pile a bit more energy on, raising a key or a note and adding some more flangey guitar and more animated bass line. But when we get to the chorus again, it feels like it falls back down to that bass line of not particularly engaging for me again. Even the listing of all the things happening to the car, which I really enjoyed in the original, isn't treated with the same feeling of breakdown that we had before, either in music or in vocals. I liked it in the original when they started listing the vehicle's many problems and the track also started falling apart. I feel like it's a shame it didn't do that in this one. It doesn't feel like the vocals and the music know they're in the same song. The music's going along and then the vocals are just along for the ride, which it shouldn't be. The vocals, I feel, are the main point of this. So yeah, even though this one is more substantial and technically superior to the original, I think the original has more heart and humanity in it. I mean, this remake doesn't even have the final Death Wish scream, which is a masterful ending to the original. So yeah, I don't really know what this version is achieving. I don't know whether or not they had Calvert's vocals just wild. I guess maybe they didn't, because to take the musical ability that they have now and bring Calvert back may sound amazing, and maybe that's what something like a 5.1 surround system version or something may be able to do. But I feel like doing this version how they have hasn't updated it for the current audience or really even the current technical ability. It just feels like a slightly fuller but somehow absent version compared to the original.
I can imagine seeing Hawkwind and they do Death Trap with Ron singing it, and in the crowd I would almost certainly have thought this is absolutely killer. And then it might make its way onto a live album and I'd go, that's amazing, doesn't he do it well? But you go into a studio and record it, it's different. And it's so difficult to do something and not just be compared to the first guy who did it. The first one feels very minimal in terms of its punk ethic. It has a garage feel to it. This one obviously has the benefits of, I was going to say a better studio, but actually I think it's the same studio. They're both Rockfield, I think. But, just generally better production, I would imagine. And he does bits of it pretty well. The whole monkey on elastic stuff, I think he delivers that pretty well, and I quite enjoy that. But I would have made a different choice, I think, if you were going to record a Calvert-era song, which is why I keep going back to the live thing, because I can only imagine that you choose Death Trap to record on the album because they've been doing it live and it's been working. Otherwise, I'd probably make a different choice there for a PXR5 or Quark track that you would put on here, given how the rest of the album sounds. But, he does a pretty good job of it. And when you're actually standing on the mic trying to deliver the lines that the other guy did, it must be pretty tough. So, yeah, not bad, but would have been like a bonus track or a B-side or something for me, and better dealt with that way.
It was funny, though, when you just said the monkey on elastic, because I heard that on this track and then I had to go and check whether or not that was on the original because I didn't remember it. And so it's funny that actually the one thing that this new one does is make me realise that a lyric existed, which is funny because I don't get the same power as the lyrics that I'm expecting. But that one lyric is definitely much more prescient here. So nice to know the Death Trap itself at least has a funny little mascot to join the driver in Certain Doom.
Yes, indeed. And we all need one. The next one is based heavily on a track from an album that you liked very much. It's Wastelands, which was Wastelands of Sleep on the Xenon Codex, which was also, I think, on the Dave Brock solo album Agents of Chaos as well, and was kind of moved back and forth. So it's obviously a track that Dave likes very much, even though it's only like just under 1.5 minutes. Did you remember it from Xenon Codex?
I remember it sounding familiar, and I did go back and try and find it, and I have on my notes Requiem for Wastelands of Sleep ? So I'm glad that that's what it was. And generally I do like the vibe of this. It has like an early 90s rave style to it with the rapid piano chords and the synthy pads. if a fast skittery breakbeat suddenly dropped on top of this at any time, it would sound like a Helter Skelter record from the early 90s and fit the vibe perfectly. So I think that they're actually quite bang on with this as more of an Alien 4 version, which this is not, in brackets, but if it was, then I think that would work. It's definitely a better return than Death Trap for me. It almost feels like it's an extended intro to Are You Losing Your Mind? So I'm not quite sure why it's its own track, because they fade together so well you'd probably never play it by itself. So overall it's nice. I would have actually liked to have seen it a bit longer and make it its own track. It's nice, a little short, a little random, but overall nice to hear it again.
Yeah, same. Wastelands of Sleep was a track that I did like on Agents of Chaos, and again when it came up on Xenon Codex. If you're bringing back a track from a previous album, it would be nice to develop it and build it out a little more, if you know what I mean. If you're taking the effort to redo something that you've done before, make something more of it would have been my wish, because as you say, it's quite nice, and as a platform to go further, you could do some interesting things with that. But yeah, it stays there for 1 minute and 22 seconds, and I wish it was slightly more. And it goes into Are You Losing Your Mind?, which is actually based on the Iron Dream from Quark's Strangeness and Charm, which was the end track. But this has words added to it, I imagine, by Ron Tree. The track is credited to Tree, Brock, Chadwick and Davey. And I recognised it as the Iron Dream only when we got towards the end of it. How about you?
No, I don't think I did. I missed that one. I must say I passionately hate this track. I hate the way it takes over so nicely from Wastelands as well, because that's a really nice transition, and then for me it just falls apart and sounds like a band's first demo tape. The track is kind of punky and thrashy out of nowhere, and the lyrics are just really dumb, so it doesn't sit tonally for the rest of the album at all. For me, the only song that can get away with saying that they were walking down the street is Do Or Diddy, and maybe not even then. So already it's an annoying opener. And then just the fact they've got this silicon chip in their brain, I'm just thinking, how do you suddenly realise you have a silicon chip? It's completely ridiculous. And then they just keep repeating it in more and more annoying ways. And then in comes the organ, which I'm assuming is the Iron Dream notes, but I didn't get that. Then it just goes into its freak out, which does nothing for me, and then just finishes with this screaming, Are you losing your mind? And I'm kind of answering, yes, I am losing my mind listening to this. And I would really like it to stop, and then it does, and then I'm happy. That's pretty much all I have to say. Not my favourite track.
No, I can tell. I doubt whether this is going to end up on any of the playlists. This track doesn't do anything for me. I don't dislike it as viscerally as you. But given that it's based on a track from an absolutely brilliant, brilliant album and closes that album out brilliantly, this does not improve or build on the Iron Dream. And that's the thing that annoys me. I could deal with the silicon chip in my head monologue if it was over something that was not a wonderful track from a brilliant album. It feels like that's the thing that puts the nail in the coffin for me, is that. So it's slightly irritating.
I don't know if you've seen the latest Deadpool film.
No, I haven't yet.
At the very beginning, Deadpool digs up the skeleton of Wolverine and starts fighting bad guys with the corpse of Wolverine.
I see where this is going.
That's almost what I feel has happened here. They've dug up something great and are now messing around with it in a way which feels massively disrespectful to the source material. I remember when we were talking about Iron Dream, just in an instrumental, they'd got this whole idea that the government was going to get them and there was no escape and there was tenseness and craziness.
Yeah.
So to take that and do this with it feels very weird, like they're treating their own historied work with no respect. It kind of feels weird to me.
Yeah, it's a strange one. I mean, all of these to me, Death Trap, Wastelands, Are You Losing Your Mind, they all feel to me like they should be bonus tracks, and they're not. They're on the canon album, and that slightly annoys me. Even the ones I don't mind. I don't mind Death Trap, and I like Wastelands, but for me, they're not a coherent part of Alien 4, the concept that we've heard for the previous 50 minutes or whatever it is. So yes, I was slightly irritated by Are You Losing Your Mind? So we get to track 15, which is Space Sex, not Space X. There is no Elon here, for which I think we can all be very grateful. I've got a question for everybody out there, because this is listed as being a track on the vinyl and the Atomhenge CD only bonus track. So the question I would have is, was it not on the original CD release? I can't remember if it was on mine or not. If it's a bonus track on the vinyl, that's really weird, because most vinyl releases have fewer tracks on than the CD releases. But it says vinyl and Atomhenge CD only bonus track. And I wonder if the Atomhenge is in the wrong place there, and actually Atomhenge reissued this on CD and vinyl and added that track to it. So if anybody has the re-release vinyl or a re-release of the CD, or more likely if they have the original CD, and tell me whether Space Sex is on it, I would be grateful. And with that, Matt, Space Sex, which is not a question.
So it's a demand? I mean, what a way to end the album by sounding like it's about to begin.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's either a live recording or has been engineered to sound like it, because it has these big crowd cheers and Dave saying, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," which I took my opening for the podcast from. The opening few seconds with the keyboard sounds like a 70s game show theme. It's just the voice of the synth, which sounds faintly ridiculous, and I was all ready to hate this track, but then this levitation style guitar comes in and then the bass drops and it actually all sounds pretty great for a while. Then we get Dave announcing that the theme for the show is SpaceX, which doesn't really do anything to elevate the piece, so I'm not really sure why they decided on that as a way to go, but whatever. I feel like as well they need to clarify it by saying, I repeat, it is SpaceX, because, you know, nothing helps land a point like having to repeat yourself. After that announcement, we have some rather bouncy instrumentation at a reasonable tempo to bop along with, which is nice. There's some other vocalists doing some kind of quote-unquote sexy MCing over the top, which I could personally do without. Then we go back into the opening breakdown and it's over. I mean, if anything's going to feel like a bonus track, it's this. This feels so unattached to the vibe and content of the album as a whole. Without any vocals on this, it would be a neat little piece of uplifting instrumentation. With the vocals, it's just a little odd. The fade out leaves me wondering, could there have been something that may have got us to a satisfactory ending? But I feel like coming to the end of this album makes me feel like I bought a second-hand book, taken it home, and I've realised the last half of the final chapter is missing. I've come all this way, and it's just kind of stopped without any real denouement to it. So from an album which felt like it was trying to have a full idea with its name and the art and the abductions and the aliens and all this kind of stuff, by the end of it, I feel like it's forgotten what it was doing and just kind of wanders off while I'm left to just watch it depart.
It's funny that you see it as like reading a book and then realizing the last chapter's not there. For me, it's like reading a book, but then they've put the opening chapter to the sequel at the back of the book to entice you to buy the sequel. And yeah, it is odd where it is, all that cheering and everything. You kind of want that at the beginning, and that could lead into Abducted and the story of the guy with all the different aliens and things. You could make that work. But it clearly is very, very separate from the rest of the album. And the fact that it's been kind of tacked on to the end of the reissues tells its own story. Probably a better way to complete things than Are You Losing Your Mind? So for that, I'm pretty happy that it's there. And that is the end of the music of Alien 4. But the concept of Alien 4 is very much of a piece with its packaging when we get to the album cover, which is by Alan Arthurs again. We've seen a few Alan Arthurs covers at this point. He did the ones from Electric Teepee to Love in Space. Love in Space is an album that follows this, which is live or part live, and it's not listed on Wikipedia in the Canon Studio albums, which means we will deal with it in the end of decade roundup. So for anyone who wants us to do Love in Space and is going to email in and ask us if we're going to do it, no, we're not. But Alan Arthurs did those covers. He was part of the band's crew, worked on the farm, as we've talked about before. And he commented on this album cover that the album cover questions who the aliens are, whether the human race has now become both alien to and destructive of nature. So we've kind of become aliens on our own planet, which I think we can all sympathise with. So yeah, it's an interesting cover, Matt.
There's a lot going on.
Yeah, which reminds me of the other ones that we've seen. Remember, we looked at Electric Teepee, had just huge amounts going on in it. So Alan does cram references in.
This is the only time that maybe Alien 4 has made sense to me, because the way it's done is that all the letters which are not symmetrical have a reflected counterpoint. So it's like Alien 4, but you have as well on the left the A. So I was wondering whether or not the album could be called A Alien, but actually you need the 4 then to flip that A.
Well, of course, the big A on the left also doubles as a 4.
Exactly. So it's like 4 Alien 4 or Alien 4. So yeah, I'm still not quite sure why it's called that, but at least it made a little bit of sense, maybe. I don't know. Maybe I'm trying to calm myself into thinking I understand, but I don't.
No, it's interesting that Hawkwind, the band name, is in there in a very conventional font. You know, we're used to Hawkwind actually being like a logo rather than just the name of the band on the front cover. So that's intriguing. I like what Alan has done with the word alien in the top there. It doesn't make sense or mean anything to me, but it doesn't have to. It's just kind of pleasing as a thing. And the 4, as you say, I have no idea what the explanation for the 4 is. Somebody might message us and go, for God's sake, you idiots, it's this. And we'll go, oh, but I doubt it. It's striking with the traditional X-Files grey alien peeking round the cover or whatever it is, if you like, into a different world where there's, you know, nature and all the rest of it. It's another very striking cover.
From this, I wasn't getting that we were the aliens. What it looks to me like is that there are aliens from space and they are coming into our world by disguising themselves as animals, because every alien that's crossing this sort of fiery threshold is transforming into an animal. This big alien at the top, his hand as he reaches through the atmosphere is turning into a hawk. There's an alien at the bottom that looks like he's about to turn into a cheetah or something. So I was wondering whether or not they were saying there are aliens, but they're disguising themselves as animals to keep an eye on us or to live with us or something. So that was what I was getting.
Yeah, that's well spotted. I do think that with Alan Arthur's artwork, the beauties of it is that they do seem to fit the content of the album very well, while being able to be interpreted in a number of different ways. There's a lot to see and to think about when you look at the covers. Definitely what you're saying there makes a lot of sense, and I like that quite a lot. And it's interesting that, of course, the aliens, the greys, they always look quite menacing. But actually, in this scene, either they're actually the good guys, or in fact, they're not there at all because the aliens is us. So there's a lot to see and think about just as pieces of art. I quite like the Alan Arthur's covers.
I was wondering whether or not these aliens were trying to come and console the people who were on the jungle side of this divide, because as well as having the aliens in space, when we get to look at Earth, there is this large industrial city that's clearly smoking and polluting on one side, with this kind of police state barrier wall that look a little SSE, keeping people out. But then you have on the other side these naked African looking people who seem to be just fairly peaceful about it, apart from this one dude who looks like a very sad Mr. Punch, who's kind of in the bottom right hand corner, seeming very upset about stuff. This reminded me a bit of the gatefold for the Prodigy album that came out in 1994. That inner gatefold had a smoking, polluted police state on one side of a ravine with a bridge to a more meadowy feel where there's a free festival going on and there's a hippie giving the police state a finger and cutting the rope to the bridge so they can't get them. And I felt like there was a similar thing here where these riot police are not letting people into their polluted wasteland, and whether or not the animals or the people actually want to be there or not, there's a clear division between these things.
I'd agree with that. I wasn't aware, I hadn't seen that image before, but you put it into our deck of notes and it definitely makes a lot of sense. On the Alien 4 cover, I like the colours. Like, I kind of associate this album with that kind of purpley blue colour. It feels like, if it's not a strange thing to say, that purpley blue colour is the colour of the music on this album. I haven't seen the gatefold before because I don't have the vinyl, but there's some interesting things in here. Not least of which is actually a reference to the double-headed hawk logo of Hawkwind, like a little bit of a nod to the past in there. But there's some interesting bits on this gatefold, Matt.
Yeah, seems to be a mixture of band photos and also almost looks like concept artwork or maybe stuff from Alan's sketchbooks or something. There's what looks like a winged angel figure in the top left who is being carried or is being caught or something. He's definitely interacting with the aliens that look like the aliens from the front of the cover. And then on the bottom right looks like some kind of alien moon dome that could also be some kind of music venue, which seems to mimic a little bit the classic flying saucer spaceship that we have on the left there as well. And then on the right we have this mural, I guess, that has the same spaceship and then has the aliens around this circle pattern, but they look like they're waving and shrugging and saying hi and stuff, so they feel more friendly than they've ever been.
Yes, they are more cartoony than the aliens that we've seen thus far. And the one at the top who appears to be shrugging actually made me smile. I thought that was quite funny, and they're doing peace signs. So yeah, it's a very interesting gatefold. The gatefold does actually make me want to try and get hold of this on vinyl, but probably not for the prices that people want on Discogs, which are like 3 figures. The alien on the back cover is definitely not cartoony, but does look like a man in an alien suit.
Yeah, I was wondering whether or not this was from their show.
Yeah, it could be. It does look stage showy, doesn't it? Because that suit would be the kind of thing that would reflect all the lights and whatnot. So yeah, it could be.
It's probably the least inspiring album back cover we've ever seen from Hawkwind, which is a shame considering maybe they just left it all for the front. There's not really a relationship between front and back this time.
No.
But I feel like with CD design, somehow that was always the case.
Yes, I agree.
I felt like CD design got very utilitarian. They saved the artwork for the front so it would attract your attention at HMV.
Yeah.
And then you flip it over and then you see, oh, it's got that many tracks, it's got that many sides, it's got that many people on it. Cool. People didn't expect the design to really work its way back onto the back so much.
No, exactly. And this is full of writing on the back, but with the guy dressed as an alien on it. And previous Alan Arthur's covers, when you unfold the gatefold, it's one piece, or at least the back, as you say, has some relationship to the front. So yeah, it's a little bit underwhelming. But on the whole, it's another very interesting, quite deep piece of Alan Arthur's artwork for a Hawkwind album. And the last one that we will see doing the Canon album run, although we may comment on the cover of Love in Space when we do the decade roundup, given that that would be Alan's final cover for Hawkwind. So there you go. That is Alien 4. The music and the artwork and the lyrics and the band. We are going to give our concluding thoughts on Alien 4, but before that, there's actually some concluding thoughts of the band themselves. This is in Ian Abrams' Sonic Assassins, where it says, Ron Tree found the finished record something of a disappointment, which he partly attributes to coming into the band midway through their work on the album. There was quite a lot done, concedes Chadwick, or at least we know how it went. So on some tracks are more Ron-driven than others. He just glued himself on top of it. I could only do so much on the album in a creative way, adds Tree. The music wasn't written by me, so I'm singing karaoke over Hawkwind music. I don't think some of the riffs were that good, like Xenomorph. I thought they should move away from that style and do more like Blue Skin, which was Dave's. I had to make the best of what was there. Chadwick has different reasons for finding fault with the result. The record sounds to me disjointed in terms of getting the idea across and ended up being a collection of songs roughly tied in with a theme. It didn't have that really good integral narrative that makes a good story with a beginning, middle and end. So that's some of the band. And in Carol Clark's The Saga of Hawkwind, this continues. Davey says of Alien 4, it didn't seem to me like it was one of those stunning turning points. Although, again, it was a good album and there was some unusual stuff on it. Kapal sticks out, a Hawkwind instrumental. I thought the album was meant to take a more rocky direction. Here we go, this is great. I was writing more rocky songs already, but the band didn't seem to be interested in them. They wanted to go back to the sequencing of keyboards and all that stuff. So the band themselves are fairly underwhelmed with the resulting album, Matt. What's your way to sum up how you feel about it?
I feel if the album was being released today, I feel like it would be an 11-track album with 4 bonus tracks, like we've said. So for me, we'd end at festivals. even the actual ending of festivals, I feel could work now as the unofficial album ending if the ending delay line lasted a little longer. You know, nice fade out after all that energy and leaving us with the Days of the Underground vibe and being out. I think that could work. I think overall this is an album with 3 tracks that I like, and then the rest of it is so much stuff that I've never really been able to gel with. So it's not an album which I am particularly fond of. I do like my change of opinion on festivals. I like the fact that repeat listening actually turned that into a track which I have really grown to enjoy, probably appreciate rather than enjoy, if you see what I mean, in terms of what happened to it, even though it is a nice piece in its own right. I definitely have preferred the couple previous, and going back to some of the more Hawkwind staple things I don't think has been massively effective in terms of trying to bring new things. They've obviously got new people again, that brings new ideas. Clearly it sounds like those new people felt a little restricted, and I think that restriction does come out in the listening. Some of it does feel a little lacking cohesion. I just feel like they've told better alien stories without just shouting "we are aliens," and I think that's the problem. I think some of this feels a little basic for Hawkwind.
It's a bit on the nose, right?
Yeah, which then just feels a little first draft or a little uninspired. And I think this is the problem that sometimes Hawkwind get, is because when they're good, they're so good that when they fall shy of the standards that they are able to achieve, sometimes that can be disheartening. They're almost the Simone Biles of space rock, you know?
That's got to go on the back of somebody's book.
That's not fair to them, but it doesn't mean I don't feel it. No. Somewhere alongside illicit jank, which I believe was actually used positively. I actually like this album more now than I did when we first went in to be re-listening to it, because I thought, oh, okay, it's this one, I'm a bit meh. But strangely, this feels better as a whole than it does when I pick the individual tracks out of it. There's 1 or probably 2 tracks on here that I would re-listen to, which means that there's 13 that I wouldn't. But when you put it all together with the on-the-nose and incredibly messy concept and the rather clumsy way the concept is integrated into the songs, weirdly, I find the total result quite pleasing. So it's a very strange thing to me, this one. But it also is interesting in the context of a band now looking at which way do you go from here. And it'll be very interesting to see what the next part of this is. With that in mind, we should do our customary thing of taking a look at a group of people who are a bit of a stand-in for wider Hawk fandom. Hawkwind fans obviously are massive, diverse people with a wide range of opinions about these. But there is a small group of people who were sizable enough to provide us with a bit of a litmus test, and they are on the Hawkwind Fans Worldwide Facebook group. And they were gathered together by Elric Newby for a book called Hawkwind Fans Worldwide Facebook Top 40 Albums, where we can see the votes cast for all of these albums and see where this one ended up. And Matt, I suspect you might be a little surprised by this. When you remove the live albums and the compilations and you are just looking at the Canon studio albums themselves, Alien 4 is number 8. It is in the top 10 Hawkwind albums, according to this group. It rounds out the top 10 for us. There are 6 from the 70s, 2 from the 80s, 2 from the 90s. It goes Warrior at 1, Quark, Strangeness and Charm at 2, Levitation at 3, Hall of the Mountain Grill at 4, Electric Teepee at 5, Do Re Mi at 6, In Search of Space at 7, Alien 4 at 8, Chronicle of the Black Sword at 9, and PXR 5 at 10. In fact, in his book, Elric, when he wrote this up, he was surprised that this one was number 8. So there you go. I am surprised by that.
Yes, that's an understatement, I suspect.
Given the fact that even the band was like, we're not sure about this one. But,
yeah,
you know.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder whether the tribal memory of It Is the Business of the Future to be Dangerous and White Zone means that people were just really happy to have some rock songs again in there. Or maybe it's the memory of particular tracks. Or maybe there are a lot of people who just love this album. And we've loved albums that have been some way down the list. One of my favorites is Choose Your Mask, and I don't think it's even in the top 20. So yeah, it's an interesting one. But I always find it fascinating just to see where people are at with these things. So, Matt, it's not going to be too difficult, this one, I suspect. The master playlist selection from Alien 4.
There have been some albums where I have been able to maybe pick something which I have a feeling is not the quote-unquote hit, but still for me calls out a track which I respond to from Hawkwind. And sometimes it's the same one that everyone else agrees with, and sometimes it's not. I feel with this one, there is really only one choice, and I can't contrarian my way out of it.
It's Blue Skin,
right? No, it's Mr. Stan.
Yay!
And it's just a great track already, a fun idea. They're having fun with it. We can have fun with it. It's accomplished. And that breakdown in the middle absolutely seals the deal for probably one of my favourite Hawkwind tracks ever, which is funny, again, on an album which I more or less can't stand. It's always funny that there are tracks still which are really good, you know? And it's just interesting to feel like you can't tar an entire album with an opinion, because there are diamonds in the rough if you do listen for them. And it took me a while. It really did with this album. And the first 5 tracks always made me feel like it was going to be difficult, but this one has always been there waiting patiently for me to arrive at it to entertain me, and it does every time.
Very fitting, and I would be very surprised if anybody disagrees with that selection. Of course, on the HAWKBINGE Sessions playlist that combines our various turntable picks with your favourite tracks from the Hawkwind albums we listen to, there is a second track from the album to be added, and which will it be?
It's going to be Festivals. I think Xenomorph has some really nice things going for it. I think it's fun. I think maybe I like it more because it's not what the rest of the album is, and it's more like what I would like from Hawkwind. However, Festivals has, like I said, the history, the story, the reality of what was going on with some really nice instrumentation. It's a really nice length. It has a brash confidence. It has Brock being a good singer on this, and he's not doing that many vocals on this. So for him to be there and to do this, it feels like his personal story. And like I said, I was here for it. I feel informed, entertained, slightly sad for a scene I never knew, but feel like I would have had fun if I was there. And it was great to have this finally brought from tangential story into our furrow so we could actually talk about it.
Fantastic. We are of one mind. Those will be added to the HAWKBINGE Sessions place. Aren't we up to volume 7 we're now putting together? It remains to say that we mentioned the t-shirts that we were wearing at the New Day Festival earlier in this podcast. You can buy those t-shirts. The Mighty Skullprint have the boutique collection of HAWKBINGE t-shirt designs, and all of the money that HAWKBINGE makes from the sale of these t-shirts is donated in its entirety to the British Bee Charity.
And if you wear one to a Hawkwind gig, you can have the fun of someone coming up to you saying, "Are you Matt and Andy?" and you say, "No."
Excellent. And surely it's got to be worth it just for that. So earlier on in this podcast, I teased the fact that we have a very, very special bonus for you that we're going to go into now, where we spoke with Joe about the release of his new book, which is closely allied to the book that we read from so liberally during the 70s run of albums, Days of the Underground. This is called Sideways Through Time, and it's great to see more Hawkwind content coming from Joe Banks. So it's time to slide sideways through time with Mr. Joe Banks, and here it is. Joe, wonderful to see you again. How are you?
I am good. Thanks so much for having me on and doing this. It's really, really kind of you to allow me to keep plugging away at all of my various things and just generally being on a PR bonanza.
Not at all, Joe. You're part of the crew. This feels particularly good because with you bringing out a new Hawkwind book, this feels like you've come home, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. So the place where Hawkwind is discussed and ruminated over. So this is obviously different from Days of the Underground in as much as this is actually just me editorializing, having asked the questions, and it's the kind of Hawk crew themselves speaking. But yeah, great to be here.
Now, before we start, this will appear at the back end of our Alien 4 episode, which we are about to record. So without giving anything away from our side, although listeners will just have had probably about 2 hours worth of Matt and I, where do you stand on Alien 4?
It's where Ron Tree joins. I think, as you perhaps discussed, they were becoming more and more like an instrumental outfit, and they certainly didn't have a defined frontman. And I think getting Ron Tree in was all about having a bit more of a focus live again. But then he very much brings his own personality to the album and is Calvert-esque in places. So it's an interesting album from that point of view. There's definitely some good stuff on it. The recording is very much a Dave Brock production. It's quite grungy in places, but it's an interesting album. So I think you'll have a lot of fun with it.
So, Joe, Sideways Through Time, which has just come out, and most excellent it is too, been leafing through it. It has an interesting history, doesn't it, with regard to the tome Days of the Underground that we read from so liberally during our 70s episodes.
Yeah, so this was originally a book which was given away with the special edition of Days of the Underground. So Days of the Underground is still available in paperback, but there was 500 copies of a special edition when it first came out, which was hardback. And one of the things that came with it was this book of interviews, because I'd ended up speaking to so many people during the writing of the book that it seemed absolutely crazy that most of this stuff I just wouldn't be able to use. And so I discussed with Strange Attractor, the publisher, why don't I just do this book of interviews and just stick the interviews in a separate book. But obviously there was a lot of people who only heard about the book after the special edition had sold out, but they heard about this extra book and going, oh my God, why can't we get this? We want to get this. And so over the space of 2 or 3 years, kind of come round to the idea that maybe I should do another version of it, especially because in that time I'd ended up speaking to quite a few Hawkwind people and Hawkwind related people who I hadn't got to the first time round. And so there was extra material. So that's basically why it's come out. I was slightly wary of people who got the special edition and wanted this very rare freebie, as it were, for themselves. But I think for the most part, people have been fine about it. And as is the way of Hawkwind fans, they're probably all going to buy it again anyway, which is very kind of them to do that.
Is this like your Silmarillion?
Well, I call it an oral history, which, as I say in the introduction, is a bit of a cheat because oral histories are usually a book which is composed out of the voices of different people, but they're kind of cut together. This person says this, person says this, whereas this is much more just a book of interviews. Obviously, it's me who's asked the questions and has guided the interview. And by the questions I've asked is how I've got the responses that have come out. And it's quite interesting because, I mean, you speak to people who had clearly been interviewed a lot before, and often people will fall back on kind of set responses. And there, the job is to try and get them to say something different or think about things in a different way. So that was some of the interviews. But quite a few of these people, and this was one of the reasons why I really wanted to do this book, they hadn't kind of really spoken on record at all before, or certainly not for a very long time. So I think there's some very, very interesting people in the book that people just won't have come across before, who are actually, though, really important to the Hawkwind story.
Of all of those interviews that you did when you were putting Days of the Underground together, are there any that you remember particularly fondly?
Well, I mean, they were all all special because obviously, it becomes very real when you say, I'm going to write this book. And then you think, OK, so I need to speak to people. And then you suddenly think, oh, my God, I'm going to be speaking to Dave Brock. I'm going to be speaking to Nick Turner. These people who, when you grew up and you were uber Hawkwind fan, and these are the guys, and then suddenly you're talking to them. And it's quite funny after, as long as you're reasonably well prepared, after 5 or 10 minutes, pretty much everybody was very nice, good with their time. I was thinking about this, though, in terms of the interviews I really enjoyed. Alan Powell, who was the second drummer from 74 through to 76, he was very, very funny. He's a Mancunian guy, lives in America now, but he was very, very funny. But I think probably the interview that I was most amazed to get was the interview with Pamela Townley, who was Robert Calvert's second wife. And that's the one which is right at the end of the book. And that really is one of those interviews that really does give you an insight into Calvert in a way that nobody else really was able to. And that was just one of those things where I thought, there's no way I'm going to be able to get hold of this person and find her. And even if I can, she's going to say, I absolutely don't want to do this. As it was, I managed to track her down when I put my mind to it relatively easy. And she was absolutely delighted to talk about Robert. As she says, being married to Robert was one of the most amazing things in her life, even if they did divorce after 3 years. But yes, that was a really amazing interview.
I can totally imagine. And in putting the book together, obviously you've brought out Days of the Underground. You've then done an enormous amount of work on the Peter Hamill book. So did you have to do an awful lot of work to put these interviews into shape for this book? And did that mean juggling this and Peter Hamill?
It is funny getting into a slightly different headspace between them. There's 8 new interviews in this book, so they had to be properly edited down and put into the right format. So I did that, and then I rejigged the order of some of the interviews. It was obviously a chance to go back through things. And I mean, what takes the time is just formatting stuff, thinking, oh, gosh, this title needs to be in italic. That's actually kind of what takes the time, because I'm quite fastidious about that. I try to be as much as possible. But also on this edition as well, there's some visual material in it, which wasn't in before. I've tried to put in the most obscure but funny cuttings I can find. Like a lot of the times, the Hawkwind actually were covered by the national media in the 1970s. It's quite funny, and it's all cuts about Lemmy being on a drugs charge and Terry Ollis drumming in the nude, Stacey in the nude. There's quite a lot of nudity. So assembling it did take a little bit of time, but the framework was already there from the original book, so it wasn't too bad.
Did you have anyone who came to you because they knew you were making a book? Or did you literally have to go out and do all the work?
So mostly it was me going out, and occasionally that would be through a PR, but mostly it was just finding people who had contacts for people. So, for instance, the new interviews, I spoke to a guy called John May, who had been one of the dancers on the Space Ritual tour. And then he said, oh, would you like to speak to Jamie Mandelkow, who's the Canadian manager of the Deviants and then the Pink Fairies? And he then becomes involved with Hawkwind. And there's no way I would have been able to find him. I had no idea where to start. He's in Canada, and, and obviously all these guys are in their 70s. So then I got in contact with him, and that was a particularly good interview because the whole thing was done by email. And he wrote in this real stream of consciousness way, which, as I said in the book, I completely retained because there's no point me trying to edit it. But then he said, do you want to speak to Corinthia West? And I'm like, who's Corinthia West? And she's like, it was Nick Turner's old girlfriend. And I'm like, yeah, sure. And then, of course, I remembered, actually, I know this name, Corinthia West, because it was where Cynthia Beat, who had done the film of Hawkwind at Wembley, she had lived in the same house. And so, the whole thing kind of worked like that, basically, connections within connections.
I'm picturing you, Joe, like a private detective following one lead after another and going down this rabbit hole.
It literally is like that. And sometimes you are just kind of ringing people. Like, for instance, Dick Mick, who sadly died during the writing of the book. I mean, I spoke to him probably 6 months before he died, and he hadn't spoken on record at all for years and years and years and years. And I'd spoken to Nick Turner, and Nick Turner had given me his contact. It's not email, it's just a phone. And you're suddenly just in this position where you have to phone somebody. It's like, who the hell are you? And I managed finally to connect with him. I think I left a couple of voicemail messages, and I subsequently discovered that Uber Hawkwind fans Wolfie Smith and Pedro Bellavista, who you may have come across in the Hawkwind Facebook groups, it just so happened that they had also connected with Dick Mick recently and had found out, I think, that I was doing this book, and they were saying, you should speak to him, you should speak to him. So it was just like factors like that meant that I got to speak to people who otherwise might not have even given me the time of day. I had a similar experience with Doug Smith, where I just had to kind of ring him up and try and explain who I was. You have about 10 seconds to explain yourself before somebody puts the phone down on you. Doug was very funny because, no, I said I wasn't going to do this anymore. And then he was like, oh, okay, I suppose so. And then Doug ended up being my guiding angel through the whole process because he knew everybody and he was brilliant at fact checking. And I spoke to him loads and loads and loads. So he was absolutely brilliant.
When you wrote the book, or when you wanted to write the book, how much of it were you relying on being able to speak to anyone? Because I guess for us, the way that we work is that we are very much a satellite entity around Hawkwind. We don't need them, and we haven't really reached out. And in fact, with that whole impartiality thing, for us, it actually may not help for us to actually speak to some of them, But for you, obviously, it's a very important, integral part. Do you feel like you could have written the book without it, or was it literally without it, there would be no book?
That's a really, really excellent point, because when I started getting the idea together for the book, as you know, I mean, it's not a straight biography. It's got all of these essays in. And originally, I didn't want to write like an academic book, but it was much more me wanting to talk about the cultural aspect of Hawkwind. And I had thought I probably should speak to some people, but I don't necessarily intend to speak to lots of people. And it literally became just this chain thing where one person said, "Oh, you should speak to this person," and it grew and grew and grew. But if you actually look at the Days of the Underground, I mean, I chopped in 10 interviews, and again, I pulled them out as interviews rather than trying to integrate them into a text. And the book could still function without those 10 interviews. But having that material, it was like, okay, well, I've got an interview with Nick Turner, I've got an interview with Pamela Townley. I've got to put this stuff in because it's fantastic. To answer your question in a way, did I learn stuff by speaking to people that absolutely informed what I wrote? Yes, but not as much as you'd think. In a way, because it was about the 1970s, I was more interested in pulling the quotes from contemporary sources and seeing what they had said and what the press had said and other people had said at the time. I could have done it probably without really speaking to anybody, but having started doing that process, as I said, it then completely exploded. And that's why we've ultimately ended up with this second book of interviews. But it's a good question, actually, because a lot of biographies, it seems like people think, okay, all I need to do is interview XYZ, string all of the quotes together, bingo. I'm constantly surprised, actually, you read music biographies, and listen to slag anybody off, but the amount you read where you think you get a fairly mundane quote from somebody and they put it in just because it's this person saying it, rather than thinking, you know what, I'm not going to include this quote because it's not very interesting. And then a page later, another band member says exactly the same thing, which is also really mundane, but it's like the writer saying, but look, I got to speak to this guy. It's almost like saying, I've spoken to all these people, therefore my book has legitimacy. And right from the very start, I had some ideas that I wanted to get over, and they were, to me, more important than just, running through a load of interviews and talking to people that people have already spoken to before.
Well, I'd say you definitely succeeded in that. Going to the interviews, because of the range of people you spoke to, was there anyone you spoke to who was on the outside of it or hadn't been around for a long time, who didn't get approached, who wasn't in the press, who was actually really interested in, oh, I get to talk about my experiences now, and then it kind of all comes out? Did you have that from anyone?
Yeah, there was a few people. So, for instance, Mike Hart, who is one of the original Lensmen, he was one of the few people who found out that I was doing this and directly did get in contact with me and said, I'd like to contribute to your book, because I think if you read other biographies of Hawkwind, I think certainly Carol Clark's, there's a mythology has grown up whereby, Hawkwind's amazing lighting was all down to John Smeaton, Liquid Len, and everybody else was just his kind of assistants. Whereas Mike Hart wanted to say he was with another guy in a light show called Proteus Lights before John Smeaton was on the scene, and he had worked with Hawkwind on and off for quite a long time. And it was when John Smeaton arrived, at that point they pooled resources and became Liquid Len and the Lensman. But he was very keen on getting his place in history, if you like, which he felt had slightly been kind of missed out. I remember as well, one of the first people, and again, this was through Nick Turner, I got in touch with was a guy called Jerry Fitzgerald, who had kind of been their fix-it man, head technician in the early 70s, working for the Space Ritual period. And he was actually one of the few people I actually went to visit. He said, oh yeah, come and see me. So I went to see him. And Jerry, unfortunately, also died during the writing of the book. That was quite an experience because he was clearly not well at the time, but he was desperate to literally give me his whole life story from that period of time. And I've got hours and hours of speaking to Jerry, mostly not about Hawkwind. And a lot of the stuff was absolutely fascinating. But, I was sitting there thinking, okay, and I'm back to Hawkwind. So it was a bit awkward.
That's nice, though, that people get closure in that way, isn't it? It's nice that you've actually been a channel for people to have that experience. That must feel quite good.
Yeah, I mean, for some people, as I said, you speak to Nick Turner, I mean, he was brilliant, but a lot of what he was telling me was kind of stuff he told lots of other people. And that sounds incredibly ungrateful saying that. But as a writer, half of you is constantly thinking, okay, I've heard this before. I need to get something new out of you, or you need to tell me something different. Whereas then you have other people, and as I say, Pamela Townley is a prime example of this, who've never spoken before at all. And everything they're saying is gold. And you're like, wow, it's almost a bit overwhelming. But as he said, yeah, for some people, they really love the fact that they'd had a chance to speak about Hawkwind, although half of them would always preface by saying, well, it was a very long time ago. I don't ever remember anything. But they usually did remember something. It's just a real privilege to speak to that amount of people from that time as well, because it's a real window into another world from what we're living in now.
Absolutely. We're living in an interesting period of time where there's an interest in writing these stories and putting them out, people putting their own personal experiences of Hawkwind out, which is Paul Garbutt's book and things like that. And it's a really lucky time for us to be able to get hold of all these things. And I just have to say that I massively enjoyed Days of the Underground when that book came out and loved reading from it during our 70s episodes. And now to have all of the interviews and the research and all of those stories behind that book come out, it almost feels like here's the book and here's the making of, and you've kind of got the whole thing. Basically, it's fantastic to have it, Joe.
Thank you.
I'd also point out for people listening that your website, Days of the Underground, is an amazing library of different Hawkwind artifacts of videos and essays and photos and everything. So I definitely point people in that direction. Thank you for writing these wonderful books. We will look forward to Peter Hamill.
That's going to be even longer. Yeah, even longer than Days of the Underground. Believe it or not, it is vast.
I can imagine 2 years after your Peter Hamill book, there is a book of all of the interviews that went into the Peter Hamill book. Is this the Joe Banks formula now for sequels?
I was thinking about that, but actually I've interviewed far less people for the Peter Hamill book. Though I will find a way for some of that to get out that hasn't got into the book. But I don't think there's going to be a similar Sideways Through Time thing, but we shall see.
Fantastic. So the book is from Strange Attractor, Joe?
It is, yep.
Excellent. And available from all good bookshops?
Actually, no, it's not. No, that's the thing to point out is that it is available through places like Rough Trade, but this one's just being sold through Strange Attractor's website. So it's not on Amazon. It's not on any other online site. It's just through Strange Attractor. And as I said, it's also made it into a few specialist record shops.
That makes it much cooler and definitely good for everyone to know. If you're looking at it at all of the big online places, Amazon, etc., not finding it, this is where to go. Then go to Strange Attractor, or if you're buying something from Rough Trade, maybe the Rough Trade exclusive splatter vinyls of the new remasters, then you might come across Sideways Through Time by Joe Banks, and we will see, hopefully, if Joe's happy to do it, Joe Banks coming back for the Hawkwind album, which comes out next year when our reaction crew can reassemble.
I would be very, very happy to do that. What's the title of that again? No Space for Us?
Space is not for us, or No Space for Us?
Yeah, something like that. That's interesting. I'm already feeling it's a third part in a trilogy, but I may be completely wrong.
Indeed. We will find out. Joe, thanks for making the time to come on and talk to us about the book. It's a beautiful thing. I'm sure it'll be a big success, and we will see you again very soon.
Thank you very much, guys. Really enjoyed it. See you soon.
And that was Joe Banks. Isn't it great to have him back on home ground again? I hope you all enjoyed that. We'll probably end up cutting that out at some point and putting it out as a little bonus of its very own. But it makes for a mammoth listen for everybody out there, which I hope everyone has enjoyed. That does it for us. We are off to enjoy now some more distant horizons. We will see you next time. Technicians of Spaceship Earth, you have been listening to Hawkbinge, the Hawkwind podcast. It was devised and presented by Andy Hood and Matt Longstaff. The soundtrack was produced by Dissonant. To contact the show, drop us a message on Facebook, Instagram, or X, the artist formerly known as Twitter, by searching @Hawkbinge, or send an email to podcast@hawkbinge.space. Hawkbinge is a proud member of the Deep Dive Podcast Network. To find more great band and music-focused podcasts like this one, head to @DeepDivePodNet on Twitter and dive in. Thank you as always for listening. We'll see you next time. That takes us to Kapal or Kapal.
K-Pal. I have Kapal, personally.
That'll do.
But
You can get treated for that.